All right. And then I want to welcome everyone to this, the Winter 2022 EMR course presented by the New Hampshire Fire Academy. My name is Max Dodge. I will be the instructor of record for this course. So I'm the guy behind the scenes doing the paperwork. And then we also have with us Dave Muse, and I'll let him introduce himself. But he is the other instructor, the other lecturer for this course. And then as we do our Saturday skill sessions at each of the 3 locations throughout the state, you'll be introduced to other members of the EMS instructor cadre. And so they will each introduce themselves. Now, I think someone just raised their hand. Does someone have a question? I didn't see the name. If you do have a question at any time, just go ahead and speak up. We want this to be, a back and forth conversation. There's a lot to learn here and a lot of stuff we have to get through, but it's important that you guys stay actively engaged. So before I introduce myself, I want to hand it over to Dave, and Dave can introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Muse. I am an advanced EMT, currently practicing medicine on Brookline Ambulance here in Southern New Hampshire, as well as a per diem staff member for Amherst Fire Rescue. I'm an AEMT supervisor there, have been involved in EMS for 11 or 12 years now. Really kind of just fell into it, thought I wanted to go down the law enforcement route, and in order to be a better law enforcement officer, thought taking an EMT course would actually make me a better cop. Started doing some really cool things for the National Park Service, basically as a law enforcement ranger for them for a couple of years, doing visitor and resource protection, where our primary duties were law enforcement, but we also dabbled in some EMS, as well as, depending on the park you were in, both structural and wildland firefighting, and of course, search and rescue. Once I got wrapped up with the National Park Service, made a transition into emergency management, where I currently am working for Mass General Brigham Healthcare as an emergency manager for them on their enterprise EM team, specifically focused on training and exercise. So I do have a broad scope of knowledge in the public safety sector, as well as EMS, and just very excited to be here, and looking forward to getting to know each and every one of you here as we go through the program. Thanks, Max.
Awesome, and thank you, Dave. I'm really excited to have David here. He is sort of an exemplar of professionalism within EMS. And I think that we all have, a lot to take away from his presentation. So I've seen him teach. He's just doing a great job, and I'm excited to have him here on the team.
No pressure, Max. No pressure.
Yeah, talking him up. So my name is Max Dodge. I'm sure you've all gotten a ton of emails from me over the last few weeks. I am a paramedic. I am an adjunct professor at University of New Hampshire teaching emergency medicine, and I am the state initial programs coordinator for the Fire Academy, which is just a big fancy title for I run EMR programs like this. My background, I did 16 years in the military as a combat medic on the ground, in the air. I did a lot of wilderness medicine type stuff, so very non-traditional EMS career. If you can practice emergency medicine in a given environment, I have likely been there. I have a few things left on my bucket list. I haven't done medicine in outer space or Antarctica yet, so those are high on my hit list. I did a bit of teaching for the special operations community at a little organization called MARSOC down in North Carolina. I worked at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, both in the emergency department and up in the cath lab, which is sort of an OR adjacent area, as a paramedic. And then finally, I did some time working in the city of Manchester with the private EMS agency that covers the city for 911. So a little bit dabbling experience in a lot of different areas that EMS covers. And so my hope is that I can bring some of that varied experience to this class to sort of give you guys context. And then right now I'm in grad school. I'm doing a master's in public health, and hopefully in the future I'll head off to medical school. So we'll see what happens there. So we're going to kick off this program. First, the chief of the EMS Bureau, Chief Justin Romanello, wanted to make it in tonight to sort of give you guys the send-off, which he normally does, but he has recently been pretty ill and he's still recovering. So he sends you his best wishes, and at some point during this course, you'll probably hear from him. He'll either jump into one of these sessions or visit one of the sites while we're doing skills. So just wanted to pass along his blessings there. All right, so let's dig into this course introduction. And so what we're going to talk about very briefly before I hand it back over to Dave for the important learning is we're going to talk a little bit about your textbook. We're going to talk about the online classroom and how that's set up. We're going to talk about CPR and FEMA certificates. We're going to walk through the syllabus that was attached to your welcome letter email, and then we'll talk a little bit about the skills sessions. And then once we do that stuff, I'm going to hit on some adult learning and studying tips, which is something that we build into the courses at the Fire Academy. So by now, you should have either picked up your physical hard copy if you're doing your skills in Concord or you're doing your skills up in Bethlehem. We had enough books available for you to go and pick up your book at those locations. The Walpole crew, due to some supply chain issues, which we're all loving 2 years into this pandemic, we're still having supply issues. But hopefully we got the books in earlier this week, and so I'll be transporting the books out to Walpole either tomorrow or on Friday, and you'll be able to pick them up when you do your skills on Saturday. But this is the textbook that we'll be using, and each class session will have chapters associated with it, and so you'll want to read through those chapters before the lecture begins. So if anyone had any issues picking up their book or hasn't picked it up, physically picked up their book yet, send me a message, text message, phone call, email, or stay after this lecture session, and we'll get that sorted out. All right, so for the online classroom, if you are here now, you've figured out some of what you need to know in order to use the online classroom. But just in case you're watching this video afterwards, because I believe we're still missing 6 people, the address is ola.nhfa-ems.com, and this is the online learning platform for the entire Fire Academy and Bureau of EMS. And so there's a lot of continuing education, there's firefighter instruction, instructor certifications, all sorts of things on here. And so when you sign up for this course, I enrolled you in the Emergency Medical Responder, NHFA, and you see that little card down there in the corner. That's what you're going to click on to get access to the rest of the course. And so what do you get on here? Well, first, you get access to this video conference, and so that's pretty important for us. You'll also have access to the PowerPoint slides that we're using for presentations. You'll have access to the weekly quizzes that you'll need to complete for a grade. I've also put up the audiobook version of the textbook, so if you have any difficulty with reading, I know that I have just a touch of dyslexia, and so for me personally, it really helps to have the audiobook version in conjunction with the text version. And so all of that is available for you. You'll also have access to skill sheets. So there'll be skill sheets at each location for you to practice with, but you'll also have the digital version. And then there's also some flashcard functionality on there, and we'll talk a little bit more about flashcards later in this presentation. So when you go online, you'll see that each week is broken out into its own tab. And so the general tab is where you're going to find the big blue button. Is where you're going to find the syllabus and the CPR card uploads and things like that. But then each week, so for example, this is week 1, this is where you'll find all of those resources that you'll need. And so each week will progress to a new tab. And then at the end of the course, under final exam, this is where you will see the results of your final exam that you'll be performing in person. So if anyone needs any help with this as we move forward through the course, just let me know. So CPR cards. Having a valid CPR card is a requirement in order to enroll in this course. Now, there were a few people who took CPR courses and hadn't received their card at the time that they enrolled. And that is fine because everyone has their CPR card now. Now, what I need you to do is upload a copy of your CPR card. So, for example, you'll see this is my CPR card here on the screen. This is the document that the American Heart Association emailed me. And so I can just take this PDF file and upload it to the website, and I'm all set. If you got your card from a different agency, say it's a paper card or something like that, you can take a photo of that with your cell phone, you can scan it on your computer, whatever you need to do to upload an image of that card under this same area here. So you click on CPR card and we'll give you the option to upload a file. So please do that as soon as possible. And we can just get that first thing checked off our list. And then likewise, part of the completion requirements for this course is that you have to take certain FEMA certifications. Now those FEMA certifications are listed in the syllabus, and we'll talk about it in just a little bit. But once you complete these certifications, there's 2 from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and there's one that's run through the Texas A&M Engineering Extension, or TEEX. And so once you take those online courses, you'll get PDF certificates, and just like the CPR card, upload those PDF certificates where it says FEMA Independent Study. And so one of the big feedback bullet points that we got from the previous classes is that they felt that there wasn't enough time to get these FEMA certifications completed. And so as you'll see when we talk about the schedule, we've actually built in some time in the middle of the course for you to focus on getting these FEMA certifications done, because they are an important part of the course and cover a lot of important information in addition to the textbook. All right, so before we move on to the syllabus, does anyone have any questions about the card uploads or the online learning platform or anything like that? All right. If you do have any questions, just jump in and ask them. Definitely don't worry about butting in and asking your question. All right, so everyone should have gotten the syllabus as a PDF document attached to the email that went out. If anyone didn't get a copy of the syllabus or can't find the email, you'll also find this very same document under the General tab of the online learning platform. So right on that first page, underneath the link to this big blue button. So highly encourage you to go through that document. You can think of it as a syllabus, but it's also sort of a student handbook because it will lay out all of the expectations for your performance here. So let's walk through it. Lectures every Wednesday and Friday from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Obviously, if you are here in this session, you know where to go and what time to be here. So this will continue throughout all of the weeks that we're doing the program, with the exception of the 1 week that you will have to do the FEMA certifications, right? And we'll talk about that week in a little bit when we get to the course schedule. So again, your FEMA independent study requirement, the links to these certifications are in the syllabus, and they're also under the upload for the certifications. And so you're responsible for completing ICS 100, NIMS 700, and AWR 160. And so that's the Incident Command System, the National Incident Management System, and then a hazmat and terrorism awareness course. And so all of those are online. They're free. You just go to the website listed in the syllabus. Make sure that you have a FEMA student identification. If you've never taken a FEMA course before, you'll have to sign up for your FEMA SSID. Once you do that, then you'll be able to take these interactive web-based courses. You'll be able to download all of the classroom materials, the manuals and textbooks and whatnot. And then you'll be able to, once you've completed the course, take the final exam online. Now, I will give you a pro tip here, all right? Little inside gamer move. For the AWR 160, that's the terrorism awareness course run through Texas A&M. If you pass the pre-test for that course, you don't have to sit and take the entire course. All right. So if you've taken the AWR course in the past, or if you have any terrorism awareness training, then what you'll find is that if you take that pre-test and pass it, it'll save you a lot of time. So there you go. There's your pro tip. So each week you will have a cumulative, or you'll have a quiz that covers the material that we discussed that week. And so each week you'll have a number of chapters that you'll be responsible for reading, and you'll have a lot of material presented by Dave and I through the lecture. And then you will have a quiz that covers all of that material. So each week's quiz will only cover that week's material. Each quiz is 40 questions. They're all randomized, so no two students will get the exact same quiz. And then they're all multiple choice. And so this is the choose the best answer, A, B, C, D sort of format. Now, the final exam is going to be an on-paper written in-person exam that you'll take at whatever site that you chose, right? And so before we were doing the final exams online, now I think we're in a place where we can start administering those final exams in person again. So the final exam will be a very, very similar format as the weekly exams. Some of the questions will be very similar, but it will be significantly longer. I believe the final exam right now is about 100 questions. And so you'll sit for your exams. The passing score for all of these is an 80%. So you have to get 80% or better on all of these in order to pass. And again, the quizzes are under each of those week tabs in the online learning platform. And so you'll scroll down all the way to the bottom after all of the course material. You'll see the link for the quiz at the bottom of each of those pages. All right, so for the dress code. Now, this course does not adhere to the Fire Academy's dress code for like recruit school and things like that. The only dress code that we have is we want you to wear functional gear that will allow you to perform the skills that we require, right? So if you have long hair, we want you to keep that hair contained so it doesn't get caught in the suction machine or it doesn't interfere with your patient assessment. When you wear shoes, you don't have to necessarily wear boots or anything like that, but we want your feet to be entirely covered. This is a profession that takes you outside, takes you into people's homes, all sorts of weather conditions. So be prepared for that by wearing a closed-toed shoe that completely covers and contains your feet. So no Crocs or sandals or things like that. And then just generally your clothing should be all weather. I'm not going to tell you what to wear, but be prepared to stand outside in the middle of February, or also be prepared to spend a day inside of a classroom. So come prepared for that. Now, this course is a National Registry certification course, right? So this course will prepare you to take the National Registry Emergency Medical Responder exam. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the exam and how you're going to take it and what that's going to look like later on in the course. But for now, in order for you to complete this course, you need to make an account on the National Registry's website. And so the National Registry's website is nremt.org. And once you're on there, in a couple weeks, I'll go through the process of affiliating with this course. You have to go on and make an application for certification in order to get an authorization to test. Again, I'm the paperwork guy for this course, and so you'll get that authorization to test from me, but I can't authorize you if you don't make your nremt.org account. And so when you go to their website, you'll see an option to log in or create an account. So go ahead and do that as soon as possible, and then in another class session, I'll walk you through the process of making that application to test. Now finally, we have the course schedule. So you have a course schedule on the last page of your syllabus. So if you have any questions about what we're going to cover at what point in the course or what chapter you should be reading, everything is on that schedule. All right. So let's take a closer look at the schedule here. So we're currently in week 1. And so today is Wednesday, the 19th of January. We're doing our orientation right now. And then once I'm done talking, Dave's going to pick up and he's going to deliver information about EMS systems and a little bit about anatomy and physiology of the human body. And this is going to cover chapters 1 and 6. Later this week, we're going to talk about chapters 3 and 9, lifting and moving and patient assessment. When we get together on Saturday, we're going to use that information that you learned on Friday, the lifting and moving and the patient assessment, and we're going to directly apply that to patient assessment scenarios and getting people up off the floor and secured in stretchers. And so we're going to apply the information that you've learned during the lecture sessions. And you'll see that each week does something very similar. On Wednesday, you're going to learn an operational topic like safety and wellness. And then Friday, you're going to learn a clinical topic like CPR. And then on Saturday, we're going to combine everything that we've learned into physical skills. Now you'll notice there's a gap between week 4 and week 5. So this is what we call office hours. This week is going to give you an opportunity to catch up on any reading, to catch up on any quizzes, to do your FEMA certifications and get those submitted if you haven't done it already. And then the Friday lecture session, when we would normally have a Friday lecture, I'm going to come on here and I'm just going to hang out for 4 hours. I'm going to show up at 5:30 and I'm going to hang out until 10 o'clock at night and give you guys an opportunity to jump on the video call, to ask questions, to seek clarification, and all of that. So you don't have to show up, but if you have a question or you want to hear something said a different way, that's your opportunity to do it. Now I see, Catherine, you've raised your hand. Do you have a question? So Catherine asked in the chat, what dates are those? Let me pull up my calendar here. So between February 12th and... All right, so the date is the 18th. So February 18th is that Friday.
Max, quick question if you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is a dumb question or not, but the chapter readings, did you want those done before each specific date so that the chapters 1 through 6? I mean, I already read them for today, but do you expect them to be done by that date?
That's a good question. All right, so do I want the chapters read before the lecture that's going to discuss the chapters? Now, there's a few different ways to approach this. So generally speaking, I would say that it helps to have read through the textbook before we talk about it in class, because you can then sort of seek clarification, ask good questions, and things like that. Now, is it a requirement for you to read the chapter and then listen to the lecture? Absolutely not. What I want you to do, because we're all adult learners here, right? We're all coming into this with busy lives and individual ways of learning. If it works better for you to listen to the lecture and then read the chapter, or listen to the audiobook, come to the lecture, and then review the chapter, however you want to structure your time that benefits your learning style the best, I will 100% support you in doing that, as long as at the end of the day you're achieving on the quizzes, you're able to perform your skills, and then ultimately go on to pass your state BLS exam on March 12th. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Thanks, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. And fundamentally, my job here is to facilitate your learning, all right? You know how you need to learn. My job is to not only provide the information to you, but to facilitate you picking up that information in any way that I can. So if there's a way that I can help you or accommodate you in some way that's within my abilities, just all you got to do is ask. I see that Leo raised a hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
I just wanted to clarify the quizzes, which are on Tuesdays. So would they be on the material we covered the Wednesday and Friday and Saturday before?
Okay, so how do the quizzes work? So the quiz is going to open on the Wednesday before on the Wednesday the week before all of the information is due. Let me say that again. So the quizzes will unlock. You'll have access to the quizzes on the Wednesday of that week. Yes. Okay. So for example, today is Wednesday the 19th. The week 1 quiz opens tonight. However, you're not expected to take the quiz tonight. It's just it unlocks for this week today, the day we start covering the material. You have until next Wednesday to complete that quiz. And so we're going to talk about EMS systems in the human body tonight. We're going to talk about lifting, moving, and patient assessment on Friday. And then you'll have Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and all day on Wednesday until midnight to go back over that material, use flashcards, whatever you need to do in order to get a comfortable go at that test. Now, there's another thing built into the quiz to help you out here. Each quiz allows for 2 attempts, right? So if you want to take the quiz on Friday and you take that first attempt and you do miserably, say you get like a 30% on it, right? Don't worry. It won't give you the right answers, but it will show you which questions you got wrong, and will also give you some feedback in terms of which chapter and which section of the chapter the answer comes from. So we're not going to give you the answer, but we're going to point you back towards where the answer is, so you can go back, use the test results to drive your studying, and then maybe go back on Saturday evening, Sunday evening, and take your second attempt. And so I've built the quizzes to be very forgiving in that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, so any more questions on the general layout of the course and the schedule that we have here?
I've already taken all the famous stuff for the B level, and I've already put all the information in. So do I need to repeat and send all that for this course?
All right, so that's a good question. So what happens if you've taken the FEMA certifications before? So we are on version C of a lot of these FEMA certifications. And so when I first took ICS 100, it was on version A, and that was more than 10 years ago at this point. So if you have taken any of the previous versions, that's version A, B, or C, you can absolutely upload those certifications and meet the requirements of this program. You do not need to retake any of the FEMA certifications. So again, that's ICS 100, NIMS 700, and AWR 160. So if you've done any of those certifications in the past, you don't need to redo it. Just upload your certifications as soon as possible, and you've already completed one of the assignments. So that was a good question. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the skills session. So what makes this course pretty interesting is that we're all together as a group of students learning in the same online classroom. But then when we're doing our skills sessions, we're going to break out into various training facilities across the state. And we've done this because the northern part of the state and the western part of the state are really hard hit for EMS providers right now. And so this gives us an opportunity to get those ambulances staffed with competent providers, licensed providers, so that we can start responding to people's cries for help when they dial 911. And so because of that, we're going to be in these 3 different locations. And so if you are unsure which location that you're going to, please reach out to me. But when you put in your application, one of the things that you indicated on your application is which one of these 3 locations is closest to you. And this is also where you will pick up your book and things like that. So just to give everyone an overview of what this looks like, we have 36 students all across the state, all learning together. And so when you show up on Saturday, we're going to be focusing on the development of your EMS skills. And so everyone's going to have these skill sheets. And we've taken this down from, I believe we had something like 28 different skills, and it was just too much. And so now we're focusing just on the skills that you need in order to work in an ambulance and be a competent provider. And a lot of these will have sub-skills within them. And so instead of having a skill sheet for putting on gloves, we're going to expect you to select the appropriate body substance isolation before you begin the scenario and things like that. So we've really sort of streamlined this process. And so you're going to see a lot of skill sheets just like this one that we're going to use in order to get a more objective measurement of your skill progression. All right. So any questions on all of this before we dig into some study skills? All right, so let's talk very briefly about some adult learning and studying skills, because we're all coming back into this classroom. A lot of us have been out of a classroom for a long time, and I know that when I first went back to school after being in the military and back to school, how many participants? Yes. So Dave answered the question. So Anna asked in the chat, how many students are at each location? We capped the locations at 12 students each, just to get an appropriate instructor to student ratio. And so we had more than 80 people apply for the 36 seats that all of you guys are now occupying. So you are the chosen few. All right. Great question. And going off of that, you're not 3 different classes. We're all one class. We're all here to help each other out. So if you guys want to form study groups and things like that, I highly encourage that. And it's great to have connections throughout the state. EMS in New Hampshire is a very small community. You throw a rock and you hit 6 people that you've either worked with or people who know people you've worked with. So we're a very tight-knit community, and so I encourage you to start that process of becoming part of this EMS community by reaching out to people who may not be at your site, and try to study together and things like that. All right, so getting back into the classroom as an adult learner, there are some hurdles that we may run into, right? And we've learned a lot about the science of teaching over the last couple decades, and so I'm going to give you some evidence-based information about learning and how to be successful. So the first thing I want to give you is how to be successful in this class, and I'll give you just 3 tips, right? This is your takeaway. If you want to be successful, you need to stay engaged, you need to do the work, and you need to stay curious and ask questions. And so what do I mean by be engaged? What I mean is be an active learner. We're going to cover a lot of material over the next 5 weeks, and it covers the whole range of emergency medicine, right? We're going to skim the wave tops of a subject area that emergency medical physicians spend 8 years learning about before they go into practice. And we're going to cover that information in about 5 weeks. So we're not going to go deep into a lot of this stuff, but we're going to cover a lot of material. And so in order for you to get the most out of this, we need to stay actively engaged throughout the week. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that. The second thing is do the work. Make sure that you're reading the textbook. Make sure that you're using flashcards and that you are, listening to the audiobook if that works for you, that you're showing up to the skills sessions ready to put in the work to become competent at these EMS skills. And then finally, you got to stay curious. One of the big things about being in medicine is that it is a science. And the fundamental nature of science is that we're constantly learning more and we're constantly improving the way we deliver medicine. And you are now going to be part of that medical community. And so we constantly have to be asking questions, and staying curious. And you're going to find this applies to patient assessment as much as it does to seeking out new information about the practice of medicine. So just as a broad tip, make sure that you are asking questions and staying curious. Now, specifically about the textbook, because this is really where sort of the rubber meets the road. There is a technique that we teach secondary students or post-secondary students. That is, you've graduated high school, either you're moving on to college or you're going into a trade like EMS, right? There's going to be a lot of material that you're responsible for reading. And so this method, the SQ3R method, is a great technique just in general for digesting a text. So SQ3R is a reading comprehension method used for pulling the important information out of textbooks and then, importantly, remembering it. So the information that you gain from reading is important. If you just read the chapters, if you just read this book from cover to cover without being active and intentional in your learning, you're going to waste your time and you're going to definitely waste the effort. And so SQ3R helps train your mind to learn and comprehend the material and can be used for lots of things other than just medicine. So SQ3R is named for its steps. And so those are survey, question, rephrase, recall, and repeat. And so I'm going to go through what each one of those are. So the first one, survey, start by quickly browsing through the chapter and by reading the big headings. Look at the bold-faced words, the key terms, any pictures or diagrams. Don't dig into the chapter yet. Just read the big print. This is going to give you a big picture, sort of general idea about what is about to be covered and how it's going to be organized. And Dustin, just to quickly answer the question about whether flashcards are electronic or print, we'll talk about flashcards in just a second. The answer is whatever works best for you. We're going to have some electronic flashcards built into the course, but if they're not working for you, I'm going to teach you how to make your own. All right, so the next step is question. Now, when you look up SQ3R, some people will say that you should formulate your own questions. This may not be useful to a lot of people, especially if you're approaching the information for the first time. So what I recommend is that you go straight to the questions in the back of the book chapter. The book publishers have already written some questions for you. If you read through their questions, you're going to get a sense for what you're looking for in the chapter. And then you can go back and read that chapter with the purpose of trying to find the answer to these questions. And so again, this is a sort of active learning technique. You're actively searching the text to answer those questions. The next thing you're going to see is rephrase. This is also known as the Feynman technique. Right? Richard Feynman was this physicist professor, and he was known for his way of explaining complex subjects in very, very simple answers. And the most famous quote that people remember him for is that if you can't explain something simple, if you can't explain something in simple terms, you don't know it well enough. All right? And so what rephrasing is that as you read this textbook and you find the answers to the question, you want to restate the information in your own words. So what this does is it forces your brain to process the information in a deeper way and helps you strengthen your memory of that information. And so if you want to, you can pretend that you're teaching this information back to someone who doesn't understand it, right? So teach it back, use simple words, non-technical language, and in doing so, you're going to force yourself to explain the information in the simplest way possible, and thus you're forcing yourself to understand it at a deeper level. The next thing is recall, and so this is where flashcards come in, all right? When it's time to take the quizzes, or it's time to go back and prepare for the final exam, you want to go back to the questions in the book or any questions that you asked or wrote down for yourself and try to answer them. And so what we can do, for example, is you can write a question on a card and write the answer on the back of the card. And when you look at the question, you can answer it, flip the card over, and see if you got it right, right? And this is one of the many techniques for using flashcards. What this does is it forces you to recall or retrieve that information from your brain, and it strengthens the connections in your memory. So this technique is much better than simply going back and reviewing the notes that you wrote, right? So reviewing notes is a passive learning technique. Active recall is an active learning technique, and this is another way for you to stay engaged with the material. And then finally, we have something called spaced repetition. And again, active recall and spaced repetition, these are evidence-based, scientifically proven ways to sort of hijack the functioning of your own brain in order to remember stuff. And so this isn't specific to medicine. This will work with any learning. And so with spaced repetition, this is used in combination with recall strategies by spacing out how often you practice the recall. This means using flashcards every day or every couple of days to ensure that the information is fresh in your mind. So as we go through this course, make sure that you practice recalling information from all the weeks. So for example, next week in week 2, don't just cover information that we're going to discuss in week 2. Make sure you're coming back to week 1 and doing the flashcards for week 1 as well. And so I'm going to build that functionality into the flashcard decks that are available online. But if you're building your own flashcards, then I highly encourage you to do that. And so, for example, on Friday, we're going to learn about patient assessment, and particularly the primary survey. And so an example of a flashcard would be to write primary survey on the front, or maybe components of primary survey on the front, and then on the back, we're going to learn about ABC. And so you should be able to look at primary survey and repeat back, okay, primary survey is airway, breathing, and circulation. And you flip the card over and you see that you got it right. Now where we do spaced repetition is that if I look at primary survey and I just draw a blank, I have no idea what that means. I flip it over, I see ABC, airway, breathing, circulation, and I'm like, nope, I did not know that. Then that's going to go back in my pile to repeat immediately. So I'm going to shuffle that to the back of the deck. if I have to struggle with it, or if I say primary survey, I know it's ABC, but I don't know what the letters stand for, I flip it over. I had a little bit of it, but it still needs a bit of work, right? So that's going to go into a pile that I'll repeat later on. And then primary survey, ABC, airway, breathing, circulation, no problem. I've mastered that content. That can go in my my repeat for later pile. So I'm going to maybe hit that in another week, or I'll hit that card again towards the end of the course, right? And so again, this is one of many different flashcard methods that you can use. And I encourage you, find what works for you. We're going to give you some tools, but you're ultimately responsible for your effective studying. All right, so that's what I have for you in terms of adult learning. Do you have any questions about this information? Dustin, did that answer your question about the flashcards?
Yes, it did. Thank you, Max.
All right. Well, so I am going to hand it over now to Dave, who is going to be delivering the topics tonight.
Yeah, Max, I had a question for you real quick.
Yes, sir.
Do you know why the pirate decided to become an EMR?
Why the pirate decided to come in the I don't know.
Because he wanted to do CPR. All right. Just a couple things before we get going here, folks. I think Max did a great job covering a lot of this stuff. But before we get into kind of the meat of tonight, I've gotten a couple of side private chat questions here. The first question is around kind of the course upload or the upload of the FEMA documents. So if you've already taken a FEMA course or the Awareness AWR 160 course, we still need you to just take a picture of your certificate and go into your profile on the ola.nhfa-ems.com, your EMS profile within the state where you're at right now, and just upload those copies. There's no need to retake those classes. Just take a picture or a PDF or whatever and upload it there. That profile is separate and different than the NREMT profile that Max talked about earlier. So we just need regardless of whether you're taking the course for the first time or you've already taken it, we just would ask that you upload a copy of those certificates to that location. So that's just a side question I had gotten. And again, Max and I are happy to help you folks with that as you go through the process here. A couple other things here, a little bit different instructional technique when we're teaching or when I'm teaching in the virtual classroom. Typically, they say in instructor school, you shouldn't call on people and put them on the spot. However, I don't know if you folks are actually paying attention. So I'm going to just put it out there right now that I will be calling on people. If I put you onto this on the spot, I don't mean to do it to embarrass you. If you don't know the answer, you don't have any thoughts around it, feel free to just say pass. But really, that's my effort to try to engage you folks, and draw conversation out. Aside from that, it'll just be Max and I lecturing for 3 hours straight, and I don't even want to hear myself for 3 hours. So I can only imagine what you folks have to go through here. In the last vein there, please ask questions. And Max talked about being active learners and really taking ownership here. I think I speak for all of the instructors. We're teaching you folks a nationally standardized course for any of the NREMT states, and we can talk about that later on. But essentially, we want you to pass the course so that you pass the test. But also, we want you to learn the content and be good providers. It's not just about checking the box here and making sure you folks just learn the material, pass the test. We want you to learn the materials so that you feel comfortable out there, and that you folks can operate as EMRs and really work as meaningful licensed healthcare providers in the state. And that brings me to my last point here. I just wanted to take a second and say congratulations and thank you for everybody that's here tonight. As Max noted, we had over 80 applicants for this program, and over the past couple of years here with the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, kind of the state of healthcare is really hurting. So on a personal note, thank you for taking the time to be here and to commit to giving back to your communities, your jurisdictions, or whoever it is that's sending you here to be a member of that community. So with that, Max, prior to jumping into the material, I'd like to just take 10 minutes so we can reconvene at 7 o'clock and go ahead and take a break. Please turn off your webcams and make sure you remain muted. And then we'll reconvene here at 7 o'clock and dive into the material. Thank you. Like medical and legal issues at the scene of an emergency, while you're there tending to a patient and really waiting on a higher level provider to get there. And we'll talk through some of that in a little bit. The second competency we're really hoping for you folks to understand and take away from tonight is really how EMS systems operate, as well as some of the roles, responsibilities, and professionalism considerations as EMS personnel. And of course, quality improvement, because at the end of the day, we want to figure out how we can be better as, licensed and credentialed emergency medical responders. And when you stop and think about it, you folks as EMRs are the first level of recognized licensed patient care in the state of New Hampshire and throughout most of the states across the US. So it's really important that we maintain, professional standards and whatnot. And we'll get into that in a little while here. The third competency or standard that we're really looking to talk about in this chapter tonight is research and the impact of research on you folks as emergency medical responders, as well as how you help that research process through things like data collection, right? Unfortunately, I'm going to be the bearer of bad news right now. If you get in and start operating as an EMR, you will have to do paperwork. It's part of the job. But we'll talk about what makes good paperwork, what makes bad paperwork, and maybe some tips and tricks how you can kind of expedite the report process. But a lot of that feeds into, the reporting that you'll do will feed into further research. And one of the things I personally love best about EMS in general is that the field is always evolving and changing, because as more scientific research is conducted and we see advances in medicine and learn from things like disasters and wars and things to that effect, we can take that knowledge and bring it back to our towns and cities and whatnot and deliver a better patient experience to the community. So that's pretty cool. And the last thing we'll talk through really tonight is kind of the interaction and engagement with public health. And I think up until 2019, 2020, most Americans didn't know what public health was. I think COVID has definitely changed that, and who we're listening to, hopefully, and how information is being spread and disseminated for different things. So we'll talk a little bit about how public health as a discipline partners with emergency medical services and vice versa. So talk about how they help us and how we help them. So kind of a tall order for tonight, but we'll definitely get through it. So let's start off with an introduction. So I mentioned earlier, the EMR, really the emergency medical responder, is the first medically trained person in the professional licensure realm that will be responding to calls or may be responding to calls and actually providing care to patients. A lot of times EMRs are members of local fire departments or rescue squads. A lot of times they're, park rangers or police officers that are also credentialed as EMRs. And really it's the first line in the medical treatment, defensive medical treatment, if you will. Your initial care is usually followed by EMTs. And just for frame of reference, in order to be an EMT, the national training is about 120 to 150 hours. The advanced EMTs, which is one level higher than EMT, and that training requires you to already be an EMT and then over another 220 hours of training there. The paramedics, and that's usually about a year and a half worth of schooling, ridiculous number of hours. And then, of course, our nurses and physicians and other allied health professionals. And a lot of people fail to actually stop and think about, as EMS providers, most of the time, we're the first people in when we talk about the continuum of care in actually assessing and starting to treat these patients. So just kind of know, one of the things you'll need to know is really the differences between EMRs, EMT, advanced EMT, and paramedic. And one of the best things you folks can do as EMRs is know what level of service you need or the patient needs, and then request those resources. But we'll talk through that in a little while. So the EMS system, I spoke a little bit earlier about kind of the continuum of care here. And really, it's important that all of our personnel and agencies understand their roles in EMS so that we can operate smoothly. At the end of the day, it's about helping people. So how can we best work together to help these folks and leverage whatever resources they need to be able to get the care and attention they need in a timely manner. Close cooperation, careful planning, and continual effort are needed to serve these patients. And really, to best understand EMS as a system, let's take a look here at the sequence of events of an injured person and how that person moves through the system. So you can see here, at the top of our green box here, somebody gets hurt or somebody is having some type of medical or emergency. Obviously, in order to trigger the EMS system, somebody needs to report it. In the state of New Hampshire and actually in North America, we have the 911 system that, you can call 911 and get police, fire, or EMS mobilized. So that's how we're kind of invited to the party, if you will. Somebody makes an initial report through 911, the call gets dispatched. So they sort it out to say, okay, you live in this city or town or jurisdiction. We need to put you in touch with the most appropriate resources or whoever it is that's servicing your local area so that they can start to deploy and mobilize their resources to get to you bedside. Your first response group, again, I talked about some of those folks, park rangers, police officers, you folks as first responders, getting to the scene to do an initial scene size up and start rendering care and aid to the patient. And then finally, the EMS response. What we're talking about or really alluding to here is, the arrival, packaging, and transport of the patient via ambulance. When we talk about EMS response, there's two buckets. And on your chart here, it really breaks off here. Our basic life support, our EMTs, and our advanced life support your EMTs and EMRs in the basic life support bucket, and your advanced life support, your advanced EMTs and paramedics. Really, I kind of glossed over earlier the difference between advanced EMTs and paramedics from an hour perspective, but from a scope perspective, paramedics can administer far more medications and do some advanced procedures that advanced EMTs can't. Same with, as we compare that to our EMTs and our advanced EMTs, the advanced EMTs can provide or administer additional medications, as well as do things like start IVs or IOs, things to that effect for the patient here. So with each of our different levels of certification come a different scope of practice, and we'll talk about scope of practice a little bit later. But going back to our call here, we make a determination, do we need to send a BLS or a basic life support unit to transport this patient, or an advanced life support, our advanced EMTs and paramedics? They show up, we package them, obviously get them transported to the hospital. They arrive at the hospital, and they move through the hospital and get the appropriate level of care, hopefully they need at that point in time. I know I'm going kind of fast here, but does anybody have any questions before I keep pushing forward? Great. So step one, really, again, to summarize, is our reporting. So, somebody gets sick and a report of an incident activates the EMS system. Most people call 911. An emergency response communication center, also known as a public safety answering point, or PSAP, receives the call and reports the incident to the dispatch center. PSAP is one of those terms you probably see again, especially on maybe one of our quizzes or out on the National Registry tests. So just be familiar with the term public safety answering point. And those are the locations the 911 calls get answered at. Enhanced 911 centers use things like computers and GPS tracking to determine the location of both landline phones and in some instances are able to track things like cell phones and pinpoint people's location or a general radius as to where those individuals are located or calling from. Those aren't always right. And as you folks, maybe some of you are in the field already or are already first responders, or what I mean is you're already maybe a police officer, a park ranger, or a firefighter. Sometimes when we ping cell phones and we try to get locations, they're not always accurate. But the idea here is that the PSAPs, the public safety answering point, usually have these capabilities. They do have to jump through some hoops and hurdles to get that information. So not every call that comes into 911 is tracked through satellites and cell phone carriers and whatnot. So that EMS system, again, is the first step in the process. Step two, we referred to earlier, really the dispatch. And really the dispatch center, when we key up our mic on the ambulance or when we're out in the field, we're talking to dispatch. And these folks obviously have the appropriate equipment and personnel. They make sure that the equipment and personnel are appropriately dispatched to the scene. So, they start to answer questions and follow things like run cards and try to gather information about what it is that's going on and what the people need in order from a health perspective. Is this a police incident, fire? Do we need EMS? Do we need all three? Or is there something else going on here, like a hazmat incident? So they do that through a series of questions and whatnot. Dispatch may occur by landline telephone, cell phone, pager, public safety radio system, computer, or other means. The majority of the dispatches that come through in the state of New Hampshire actually will set off what looks like this little pager thing or something very similar. And basically think about this as a one-way radio where dispatch is able to, trip this off if I have it on and give me the information through an initial dispatch. What resources are being sent to the scene, where is the scene, what's the nature of the patient's illness or mechanism of injury, are they sick from carbon monoxide, are they having chest pain, or was it a 3-car motor vehicle accident? All that information is pushed out through a dispatch agency. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all we need to cover there. Questions on dispatch? Dustin has a question. Do most people also have active 911? Can you come off mute, Dustin, and let me know what you mean by that?
So the app that my town has that you can put on active 911, and it sort of tells somewhat details of what the scenario is and where it is, but you get more information as what the call is on the pager and stuff like that.
Gotcha. So that's becoming very popular. Does it come through like text message or an app based?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So what a lot of fire, police departments and EMS agencies have done is subscribe to another service like Active 911 or e-dispatch or some other I am responding. There's applications out there that basically dispatch can type in some information, send it through that mechanism, and it pulls up, the address with maybe directions to get there, the nature of the call. So they're common, but a lot of times it's costly. So a lot of towns rely on the old school paging systems and the radios that way.
Yeah, that's what I have also. I have both the Active 911 and my pager.
Yeah, and they're great redundancies. It's just sometimes cost prohibitive, depending on, how many calls your service gets a year and what these companies want to charge you. But they're great resources, especially at 2:30 in the morning when, maybe your dispatcher mumbles a little bit and you're like, did they say 1 Main Street or 11 Main Street or whatever? So, great. Catherine, question, how long does it take on average for a call to go through dispatch? The dispatcher at the PSAP, the Public Safety Answering Point, so in New Hampshire, that's in Concord. It's a call center with the Concord 911 folks. They'll, ask, do you need police, fire, EMS? What's going on? Figure out where it is you are, and then forward the call and stay on the line to that local dispatch center. So usually those calls are taken and forwarded within probably the 1 to 3 minute time frame from when it's answered there to the time one of the local dispatchers is on the phone getting the information and sending it out through either your application that you folks just talked about, Active 911 or I'm Responding, or page it out through the traditional pagers. Great question. Thank you for being engaged, folks, and asking questions. Thank you. So pushing on here, the next phase, again, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's really that first response phase. So the folks, firefighters, law enforcement, park rangers, ski patrol, the folks that are, typically a lot of times they're already out there in the field, maybe doing patrol work or skiing down the slopes or out, hiking a trail or whatever. A lot of times those are the folks that either happen upon an incident or they're out there in the field already, and we can dispatch them and get them there to do a size up and start to render immediate care or aid. A lot of the communities, especially in New Hampshire, have many EMRs, but few EMTs and even fewer paramedics. So when you take a look at what the National Registry's rate is for certification levels, think about it. The first level of EMR, if you will, I think the program's around 60 to 70 hours, somewhere in that ballpark. That's a lot less of a time commitment than actually, studying for 2 years to be a paramedic. So, it only makes sense that those numbers are higher and that we would see more EMRs and EMTs than we would advanced EMTs and paramedics. So, but that's not to underscore and say that the EMR, is really a key element in providing emergency care to these folks, because the information and the actions that you folks are able to convey and the steps that you're able to take on scene do make a huge difference in rendering care to these patients. So very important stuff. So the EMS system, taking a step back again to our diagram earlier, when we look at the EMS response, I talked about the difference between a BLS ambulance really staffed at the EMR and the EMT level, or an ALS ambulance staffed at the advanced EMT or paramedic level. They're really the second contact for that patient in the EMS system, because, the first responders are the first ones there. The EMT, AEMT paramedics on the ambulance is the second line there, and the second patient's contact. In the state of New Hampshire, EMRs can operate on an ambulance. You folks can provide patient care on an ambulance. You just have to have one EMT or higher also on the ambulance as well. So you can have an EMR plus one other level to operate an ambulance, which is a change from the last couple of years that we've seen, and it's been wildly successful. So a properly equipped vehicle and the EMT staff make up a basic life support unit. So, you know, what's important about this, don't just think of EMS resources as ambulances. A lot of cities or towns will have fly cars. A lot of times they'll do things like ALS intercept, so advanced life support. They'll have an AEMT or an advanced EMT and a paramedic with supplies and equipment that can intercept with an ambulance if they need to, you know, have additional providers in the back, or maybe there's a more advanced procedure or specific medication that the ambulance crew can't do or can't deliver. Those are options. Can anybody else think of other EMS resources in terms of maybe transportation that I haven't talked about?
DART or Lifelight?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. So our air medical transport is huge. So some of our big providers in the area here, Dartmouth Hitchcock has medical helicopters. Lifelight comes out, I think, Worcester area, if I'm not mistaken. We also have like Boston MedFlight that'll fly up. When you think about, you know, Boston MedFlight, you're like, oh my gosh, it's all the way down in Boston, but from the air, you know, it's a 20-minute jaunt up to southern New Hampshire for some of those helicopters. So air medical transport's huge, and a lot of times they'll be operating at the paramedic or even flight nurse level, and carrying some really cool things on board, like blood products or other advanced medications that we typically might not have in the ambulance. So patients may receive advanced life support services from, again, the AEMTs and paramedics, and in the case of air medical transport, even some doctors, PAs, physician assistants, as well as some of our flight nurses and critical care paramedics. So questions so far? You're an engaged group. I like it. Cool. So as we talk about the EMS response here, really what's important to note that all skill levels are based on what is learned in the EMR course. And what do I mean by that? Well, at the end of the day, there's a couple of things we need as human beings to sustain life, right? We need blood. We need an airway so that we can exchange oxygen and we can breathe. We can't survive, you know, a really bad case of shock. And what this slide is actually referring to here is that the procedures that you folks are taught here in this EMR course are very key and critical procedures that all level providers actually will engage in. So what do I mean by that? Well, if somebody lops off their arm from a chainsaw accident and they're like squirting blood, well, let's apply a tourniquet and let's stop the bleeding. You know, those are skills that you folks will learn how to do, but they're also the same skills our EMTs, advanced EMTs, and paramedics are going to be engaging in as well. So don't think that, hey, oh, just because, you know, I'm an EMR or whatever, I can't do, you know, deliver this advanced medication or, you know, do double sequential defibrillation and all these other advanced medical procedures, because a lot of what we're going to teach you today or throughout this course is going to actually make a huge difference. And if, you know, a lot of this stuff, it has a time component to it. So, you know, you can prevent shock from getting worse. You can stop or mitigate bleeding before the person, you know, bleeds out completely. So just, again, my way of underscoring kind of the importance of the skills that you folks are going to learn in the course here. And then finally, the hospital care. I spoke to this a little bit earlier, but the hospital emergency department is a patient's third contact with the system. And just a note on that, some of the questions you might get when you get to the National Registry is like, you know, is the ambulance, you know, what number, hold on, sorry, let me back up a second here. What step in the process of care and transportation is an ambulance contact with the patient? And you'd say, oh, well, it's a second, because you have the first responders are the first integration in the EMS system. The ambulance is the second. And then the hospital or the emergency department is the patient's third contact with the EMS system. So I didn't do a good job of articulating that, but I'm hoping you folks caught that. You'll get weird questions like that. And stop me at any time if you're like, can you say that again? Or I've got some questions. What's important to note about the hospital care is that not all hospital care is equal. And similar to the different levels of service our paramedics, advanced EMTs, and EMRs administer in the field, not every hospital has the same level of capacity or capabilities. And what we'll see a lot of times is hospitals try to specialize in specific areas. And sometimes they have specialized treatment facilities to include things like trauma centers, stroke centers, burn centers, pediatric centers, poison control centers, things to that effect. Can anybody provide me an example of any of these specialty centers, maybe that we have in New Hampshire or New England? Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
CMC for strokes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Catherine.
For the burn centers, I know that the Mass Gen.
Yep, Mass General.
I know they have a burn center.
Yeah, so Mass General has a burn center. They also, the Shriners Hospital down in Wilmington, Mass is really notorious for advanced burn care. Somebody mentioned the stroke centers earlier. As far as stroke centers go in the state of New Hampshire, really the best stroke centers actually, or the recognized elite stroke centers are Portsmouth Hospital, as well as Dartmouth out in Lebanon. That's not to say you can't take a stroke patient to CMC or Concord Hospital or any of those other hospitals. It's just the capabilities that and services that they have to offer. Dustin,
Also, the one for the trauma is also DART, and the pediatric center for Dartmouth for Chad.
Absolutely. So a lot of times hospitals will partner with different, have different affiliations out there, and partner with these specialized programs. I believe it's Southern New Hampshire Medical Center down in Nashua partners with BI Lahey for some of their stroke and telemedicine treatment. There's different agreements. All that to say, you need to learn, or you should be familiar with what specialty services the hospitals in your jurisdictions and the areas that you transport to are capable of doing. And that'll help inform the decision as to where to bring the patient, because sometimes, we want to bring the patient to the most appropriate facility. So questions on that? Great examples. And sometimes earlier we didn't talk about it. Oops, sorry about that. Sometimes maybe the level of service that the patient needs and the specialty treatment facility will dictate some of our treatment or our transportation options. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I'm out in maybe Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, if I'm up on the Canadian border and somebody's having a stroke, and I know that the roads are bad and they need to go to a stroke center, I might end up calling a helicopter to expedite the treatment and transportation of that stroke patient to get them to the stroke center that they need to get to in order to get timely treatment. So, from a transportation standpoint, knowing, again, what your local hospitals offer for services and what their capabilities are, and matching those up with the most appropriate transportation resources to get your patients the treatment they need. Obviously, we have to use discretion there because we can't call a helicopter for every single patient. And there are very prescribed and kind of prescriptive reasons for calling helicopters that we can talk about at a later date and time. But just think about that and put that in your back pocket. William, question? Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, most most of our areas here in Charlestown. So if we have a major trauma accident, we will actually send to the closest hospital to stabilize and then med flight out.
Absolutely. And every EMS service has different policies and procedures around that. So you just got to be familiar with what your department or your agency's procedures are, and what resources exist locally. So thanks for pointing that out, Nick.
And it would be like an officer on, because I know for like our fire department, it's obviously an officer who makes that call for like DART to come in. I'm assuming for EMR, it would be an EMT or an advanced EMT making that call.
So what's interesting about actually the determination to call a helicopter is it doesn't actually default to the police or fire that are on scene. It actually defaults to the highest licensed medical provider on scene to make that determination. So if you work in a town or a jurisdiction that your fire officer, your captain or your chief isn't technically a licensed provider, that person very well could be you. So that's not to put a lot of stress or responsibility on you, but the way the New Hampshire laws and our protocol is written, the choice isn't up to the cops, and it's not up to a non-licensed fire provider. It's actually up to the licensed highest level licensed medical provider on scene. Now, if you were on scene and I were on scene, obviously as an advanced EMT, that responsibility and decision would default to me. But if you show up on scene and it's just you and the police, or just you and your fire chief, that person very well could be you.
Yeah, but wouldn't you want to at some point call med control for a decision?
Yeah, let's actually put that on the back burner for now, because we'll talk about med control a little bit later on. But that's a great point. For those not familiar, just 30,000 foot overview. Med control is a resource that exists through the hospital that your agency is affiliated with. Every agency, EMS agency, is required to be affiliated with a hospital. And med control is there as a resource for you to call if you have questions, if you're unsure of anything, or if you need further clarification, like, hey, I'm not sure if this person meets the eligibility criteria for a helicopter. Med control is a great resource for you to pick up the phone or the radio and call and get that information. But we'll talk more about them later on. Great questions. Very excited you folks are so engaged. So thank you. So let's talk about public health a little bit in EMS. Again, I said earlier, prior to COVID-19, a lot of people were like, oh, public health, what the heck do they do? And I think over the past couple of years, they've definitely been earning their paycheck. But in the context of public health and EMS, some of the traditional or historic responsibilities of a public health department include things like looking at restaurant and business cleanliness, conducting things like immunization programs, flu clinics, most recently COVID clinics, right, for COVID vaccines and booster shots, determining the incidence of contagious disease, so COVID pandemic, response planning, recovery planning, things like that, and of course, preventing the incident or progression of disease. So, we have outbreaks in nursing homes or jail facilities, college campuses. Public health can be absolutely invaluable partners in providing resources and managing those types of incidents. So from an EMS standpoint, it's really important that we have a great relationship with our local public health departments and our state public health departments as well, because they can't do the work that they do without our help, and we can't do the work that we do without their help. Public health and EMS will oftentimes also partner in things like car seat installation programs, programs to encourage people wearing their seatbelt, doing things like alcohol awareness programs, looking at like helmet safety use for things like motorcycles and bicycles. Sometimes we'll partner together to do things like, a blood clinic, a blood pressure screening clinic, or, where we're checking people's vital signs. Or doing things like finger stick blood glucose checks to look at things like people's sugar levels, or to make sure they're not diabetic or things like that. And again, these are just some of the examples of partnerships that public health and EMS have together, how we help them out and how they help us out. Questions on anything I've covered so far? So kind of scary to think about, but back in the 50s and 60s, if you called for an ambulance, chances were a hearse was showing up to your house. Could you imagine picking up the phone and being like, hey, I need an ambulance or I need help, and the coroner or a funeral home shows up with their hearse? Like, people nowadays would lose their mind at that idea, and it's certainly scary to me. But what you need to know about EMS and kind of the evolution of EMS is really that's how we got our start. Really, the 50s and 60s, funeral homes, hospitals, and volunteer rescue squads really did provide the majority of our emergency medical services. And most times, these folks were only actually trained at like the first aid level. So maybe they took a Red Cross course in basic first aid, and here you are having a stroke or a heart attack or whatever, and they're showing up having only taken an 8 or 16-hour course. Pretty crazy. One of the other really important things to note, and I talked about it earlier, is the idea that EMS, emergency medical services, is constantly changing and evolving based on evidence-based practice in medicine. So there's a lot of information that gets published from the military when, following wars and battles and conflicts, things to that effect, disaster. A lot of times the civilian pre-hospital medical care has historically lagged behind military emergency care. So, as we moved into Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2003 timeframe, we learned a lot about bleeding control and dealing with explosive injuries from all of the improvised explosive devices and whatnot our soldiers were facing out there. So that information, and as horrific as those events were, and the people that died or lost limbs or any of those types of injuries, we've actually been able to learn a lot from that on the EMS side and really apply a lot of the evidence-based medicine to our practices and how we treat patients. So, for every bad thing, I guess, there's a little bit of good that comes out of it, and that's kind of the silver lining. So, questions on any of the kind of the early adaptation of where we came from? Cool. So in 1966, so again, I talked about like hearses and funeral homes rolling up to treat you or transport you to the hospital or whatever. The accidental death and disability, the neglected disease of modern society, was published. And what this was, it's also known as the white paper. It was a paper that described the deficiencies of EMS and really called out the United States for saying, ultimately, there's a ridiculous amount of transportation related accidents out there. So motor vehicle accidents. We're seeing the need for people to be transported, treated and transported to the hospitals, and we don't have the infrastructure to actually do that. And in order to reduce mortality or these injuries, we need to come up with a better system for, getting patients treated on scene and transported in a timely manner. And so in the 1970s, the Department of Transportation developed a national standard curriculum for our EMS training providers. Really kind of cool to think about. Most people don't realize that really a lot of the EMS in the United States was birthed out of this paper, as well as, came out of a standardized curriculum from the Department of Transportation. So kind of crazy to think about. You will probably see a question or two about, the white paper and, history of EMS on your quizzes or test for the National Registry. So make sure you know how EMS got its start and kind of where we came from. Questions?
Who published it?
I will have to get you the answer to that question. I'll look it up on a break. I believe, hold on a second here. I'll get you an answer on the break for that. Good question. I don't want to misquote anything here. So under the auspices still of the history and kind of evolution of EMS, during the 1980s, the use of ALS or advanced life support within EMS became common. Not the advanced EMT level, but the, paramedics, and eventually the introduction of what was back then the EMT intermediate level, started to make its debut. Today, EMS providers are trained through a standardized course like the one you're in today, and conducted by only accredited training centers here. So it's very important, again, as I spoke to earlier in the evening, that, we're professionals, we're all trained to the same standard, and that if you're, you take this EMR course and you get certified, and you're working in the state of New Hampshire, and then you go to Colorado, and you want to get licensed out there, Colorado says, hey, what's this person done to actually get trained and get credentialed appropriately? We want to make sure before we give them a license to practice medicine in our state that they actually meet or exceed the standard requirements that we set forth. So part of the reason we have a standardized national curriculum here, and that we only let accredited training centers conduct these courses. So when we look at an EMS system, what we have to realize is that there's several components that actually make up an EMS system. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, which is a group, subgroup within the Department of Transportation, because they still govern a lot of this stuff, really recognizes these 10 areas: regulation and policy, resource management, human resources and training, transportation equipment and systems, medical and support facilities, communication systems, public information and education, medical direction, trauma system and development, and evaluation. So you might see questions related to what some of the 10 standard components of the EMS system are. I'm not saying you need to memorize all 10 of them, but you might see questions around, like, what is an example, talking through dispatch or to dispatch through a radio system is an example of, communication systems, or, how we appropriately manage resources, might be a question, is an example of which of these 10 standard components to the EMS system. So just kind of review those in your book, and just kind of, you don't need to, again, commit all 10 of them to memory, but you should be familiar that these 10 components make up our system. And they're pretty straightforward. So just a note about transportation. There's kind of 3 different levels here of transportation. So we have transport, when a patient's condition requires care by medically trained professionals, but the speed in getting the patient to the hospital is not most important. So, we might not go lights and sirens. We're just having a nice, easy ride into the hospital. That's what we refer to as just transport. We're going to transport this patient. Prompt transport means the patient's condition is serious enough that the patient needs to be taken to an appropriate medical facility in a fairly short period of time. So our transports are everyday run-of-the-mill. You call, we haul. We're going to take our time getting there. We'll get to the hospital when we get there. Prompt transport, hey, this patient needs to be seen in a short period of time. We might put our lights on. We might, be using our sirens. There's a little bit more urgency than a normal transport. And then you have rapid transport. This is when EMS personnel are unavailable or unable to give the patient adequate life-saving care in the field. These are the examples of really, really bad situations. And, a lot of times we'll try to get a helicopter or air medical transport in to take care of these folks and get them what they need if we're unable to do so in the back of the ambulance or out in the field. An appropriate medical facility may be a hospital, a trauma center, or even a medical clinic. And again, what's important to note is that your jurisdiction and the agencies that you folks work for will have different agreements with these different hospitals, trauma centers, and medical clinics. And you may or may not be able to transport to specific clinics, depending on what those agreements are and the services that they actually provide. Questions about transport and the 3 different levels? Transport, urgent transport, rapid transport?
Yeah. With rapid transport, you'd be like trying to just stabilize them like where they are and wait for the helicopter, or meet the helicopter or something like that.
You may, it depends on the circumstances. And it depends on, what the short answer is it depends. And it depends on the circumstances. It depends on the resources and assets you have on scene to provide that person. And it depends on what their needs actually are from a treatment standpoint. So sometimes, if you can get a helicopter to land where you are, great. But a lot of times we'll have to actually pick up the patient, put them in the back of the ambulance, and bring them to a designated landing zone and meet the helicopter there. So the notion of rapid transport is we want to get them to whatever facility they need to go to as quickly as possible. And that may mean staying on scene and waiting for a helicopter to come to us, or meeting the helicopter at a landing zone. Good question. So shifting gears a little, this slide deck bounces around a little bit, so apologies there, folks. But in the way of EMR training, really, we're going to teach you how to take a look at patients and use your basic emergency medical skills to make a huge difference and impact for these folks. The skills and knowledge that you learn in this course will really provide you a foundation for the entire EMS system and how you actually fit into that system. Just looking at this scene here, some of these fire folks might be EMRs. Obviously, you've got the guy with gloves hanging out of his pocket. Hopefully he's wearing some on his hands too. He's probably an EMT, advanced EMT, or paramedic. You've got cops working together. And on scenes like this, everybody has a job to do. And what's really important is that people know what their jobs are. They know when to ask for help, and that we can, do whatever it is that's right by the patient and get them the care that they need. Life safety trumps everything else out there. So, if you haven't heard that yet, life safety, your safety, the patient safety of your partner, and the safety of your patient are the most important things. So your training, we're going to divide your training really into 2 main groups. When we talk about the treatment patients need, there's kind of 2 groups. And one of the groups is up here. It's trauma patients. Can anybody tell me the second group of patients that we're going to talk about and learn how to treat?
Illness?
Yeah, so you're spot on, Leo. It's medical. So when we look at patients, we kind of put them into one of 2 buckets. We put them into the trauma bucket or a medical bucket. What are some examples of medical injuries? Or medical conditions, I should say.
Slip, trips, and falls.
So slips, trips, and falls would be more in the trauma bucket here, where we're dealing with splinting injuries, maybe wounds. I'm talking more on the medical side. Yeah, so things like maybe poisoning.
A stroke.
Yep.
Strokes.
Shortness of breath.
Shortness of breath, chest pain, heart attack.
Heart attack.
Heart attack, absolutely. Those are all that.
COVID.
What's that? The Rona, yeah, definitely the Rona. No, those are great examples. So we've got our trauma bucket and we've got our medical bucket here. So let's talk trauma for a minute. When we're talking about trauma, that's something traumatically happens to the person. The person's in a car accident, they fall off a roof, a drowning, slips, trips, falls, things to that effect. There's some type of trauma, injury, or impact to actually hurt that person. What are we going to teach you to take care of trauma patients? Well, we're going to teach you over the next couple of weeks how to control airway, breathing, and circulation. We're going to teach you how to control bleeding, external bleeding, that is, using things like pressure, tourniquets, things to that effect. We're going to teach you how to treat shock, treat wounds, and properly dress them, as well as teach you how to splint and stabilize injuries. All of those things, those are skills you can do to help treat your trauma patients. The other group here is those experiencing illness or medical problems. So our medical patients, right? And you already hit the nail on the head with that. Your seizures, your heart attacks, excessive heat and cold issues, elements, heat elements, alcohol, drug abuse, poisoning. Those are all really great examples. And we're going to talk through things you can do to make a real difference for these patients. Those needed to care for patients experiencing illness or serious medical problems. Again, that in that second group, bites and stings, altered mental status, maybe from a diabetic emergency, things to that effect, behavioral or psychological crises. We've seen a huge uptick in psychological cases in the state of New Hampshire and really nationally from the pandemic. Suicidal ideations, people threatening to hurt other people. We'll talk through all that stuff. And of course, childbirth, because you could be called to deal with childbirth and deliver a baby. So our goals of our EMR training, really, we're aiming to teach you how to evaluate, stabilize, and treat patients using the equipment that you folks have out there in the field. And if you folks are affiliated with different services out there, fire departments, police departments, whoever it is, or maybe your own EMS agency, hopefully they give you, the supplies and equipment you need to be successful out there. But if not, we'll teach you how to improvise. Really cool stuff. And we've, as a former park ranger and somebody that did a little bit of wilderness medicine, I'd like to think I've gotten good at improvising some stuff over the years. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of that knowledge with you folks. And then finally, we want to teach you how to help EMTs, advanced EMTs, and paramedics as soon as they show up on scene so that you can give them a good handoff and share the information as well as the treatment that you gave prior to their arrival. So more importantly, arguably, we're going to talk about and teach you things that you shouldn't do for patients. Because in some instances, withholding treatment or doing specific things might actually be better for the patient than going in and putting your hands on them or doing specific things. So for example, it might be better to leave the patient in the position which they were found rather than move them without proper equipment or personnel. One of the other big things, and we talked about professionalism earlier, really never judging your patient, especially based on their cultural background, religious, color, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status. You're going to be called to treat people on some of the worst days of their lives. And one of the worst things you can do is judge them, regardless of what the situation is. That's not to say that when you get toned out for, sex injuries and some weird situations out there that, you're not going to have a hard time holding it together. But figure out how you can do that as a professional and, whatever it is you need to keep your composure. And treat that person with dignity and respect because you're the person they called to help them in their situation. William?
I was taught that you basically treat them as if they were family.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to think I treat my patients better than I treat my family sometimes.
We all do.
Okay, fair enough. So that might not be a good rule of thumb, but for some people, maybe. So know how to use your EMR life support kit. Again, I talked about hopefully your service is giving you, the supplies and material and resources you need to be successful in your role. As an EMR, life support kit should be small enough to fit in the trunk of your car, or your patrol vehicle if you're on police, fire, rescue, whatever. And obviously you want the supplies that you need in order to treat the patients appropriately. This photo looks like it's older than I am, but here's some of the different items that you're going to learn how to use and some of the resources that are out there. But you can see a smaller bag and different strokes for different folks. You'll figure out what kind of bag you like to carry with you, whether it's you got one strap or if it's a backpack or the possibilities of different first in bags and kits out there for you to carry your supplies is absolutely endless. So those resources are out there, and don't want to belabor that point. I talked a little bit earlier about improvising. Sometimes you'll happen upon a scene and you won't have anything except what you got on your back. So what can you use locally to splint an arm? Can you use a notepad or a magazine as a makeshift splint? Can you use a pillow as a splint? Can you take the shirt off your back in order to stop the bleeding or provide bleeding control? I saw a hand go up. Question?
No, sorry.
Nope, no worries at all. Also, we're going to teach you folks how you can assist higher level providers, because one of the best things you folks can do as EMRs is if we need extra sets of hands in the back of the ambulance for whatever reason, how we can work together in order for you, to provide the best care and treatment for the patients here. Additional skills. Obviously, we talked about the different types of first responders or EMRs that are out there and how you operate in a variety of settings. These settings can be urban areas like cities. Regional variations in climate require to use different skills and equipment in treating patients, right? If I'm up in Pittsburgh, I probably am not as familiar with scuba diving related emergencies as I might be as somebody that works in Newcastle or Portsmouth or out on the seacoast. So it's knowing your geographic area and what it is you'll be seeing and treating patients for. Same with like snake bites, spider bites. There's different variations of wildlife all throughout the United States. So as you're practicing medicine out there, you got to kind of know what what the local wildlife landscape is like, so that you can be on the lookout for treating those types of injuries. And know how to take care of patients that maybe had exposures to those types of animals. So roles and responsibilities, we want you to be able to summon the appropriate assistance. Again, I talked about ALS versus BLS earlier. We're going to teach you how to gain access to patients, perform patient assessment, administer emergency medical care, provide reassurance to the patients and family members, as well as move patients, when to move patients and when not to move patients. Really important skill. Some of your other responsibilities: seek and then direct help from bystanders. A lot of times if you show up on scene and somebody's already delivering CPR or whatever and they're doing a good job at chest compressions, I'll keep them on chest compressions if they're good with it. As an EMR, you can direct other people on scene to do things as long as it's not beyond kind of their scope of practice and what's reasonable and they're comfortable doing. Conversely, if they're trying to do something they shouldn't be, you kind of have a duty to step in and say, hey, put your scalpel away. We're not going to give this person a tracheotomy or whatever, or put your Bic pen away or whatever it is. You need to be able to advocate for your patient. We want to teach you how to assist EMTs, AMTs, and paramedics, maintain the continuity of patient care. Again, I talked about you folks being the first licensed responder there, medical responder, all the way through their continuum of care until they get discharged from the hospital. We're also going to talk a lot about documentation and keeping your knowledge and skills up to date. So with that, let's go ahead and take 10 minutes. I'm at the 8 o'clock mark, so we'll come back at 8:10 and we'll knock out the rest of this and jump into some anatomy and physiology. standard. So in our documentation, we need to make sure we clearly state that we have met or exceeded that standard. So our documentation should be clear, concise, accurate, and according to the accepted policies of your organization. Again, I talk a little bit about, that standard, like what is it that we need to be doing from a patient assessment and a treatment standpoint, and what did we actually do, and how did that all go? When we talk about documentation, and as you folks get out there on your services, you'll figure out what documentation methods you like to use. And there's a variety of different methods. Some people use the method of a narrative method where they'll, say, hey, I came on scene. This is what I saw. This is what I did. This happened. And it's got a very chronological flow to it. Other folks use a modified version called chart, where you kind of move through very specific components and criteria of what your assessment was, what you did to treat the person, what the outcome was, and kind of repeat that throughout the duration of the transport. Other folks use the SOAP method. And there's, hundreds, if not thousands, of different documentation models out there. What I would encourage you folks to do, though, is explore what those different models are. And one of the best ways to do that is when you get back to your agencies or organizations, look at other people's narratives and ask them how they actually document. Find a method that works for you and stick to it. Because what that does is, it kind of instills it in your brain, what's important and what needs to be included. And if you follow that recipe every single time in your documentation, you're far more likely to not omit important information and make sure everything's in there that needs to be there. Documentation also, and this is the second point here on the slide, it provides a basis to evaluate the quality of care given. Well, what does that mean? At the end of the day, again, we want to make sure that we tell the story of what we did for that patient and what the outcome was. Did I do the appropriate level of treatment given the patient's situation? And did it have a positive effect, a negative effect, or a neutral effect, right? What was the outcome of my actions on this patient? I don't want to scare anybody from getting out of this field or anything like that, but one of the fastest things that'll get us in a courtroom as EMS providers and professionals is poorly written documentation. So this is one of the most important skills that we'll talk about and kind of cover throughout the class. And as you get back on your services, challenge other people to look at your reports prior to you submitting them. Just to make sure you didn't forget anything, especially as you're learning and going through the onboarding process. Questions on documentation? Documentation also, again, serves as the legal record for anything that we do. Good documentation will identify what condition you found the patient in, the patient's description of their injury or illnesses. Again, I talked about trauma versus medical earlier. Sometimes they have both, right? Sometimes, grandma's driving down the road and she has a heart attack, which causes her to crash into a tree, and she's not wearing a seatbelt, so she gets ejected out the window. Well, we got a whole bunch of stuff going on. Is this a medical case that we're treating? Is this a trauma case? There's a lot going on here. We need to make sure we document, and treat the underlying issues appropriately and get her the care and treatment she needs. Nick, question.
Not sure. It's not in our area at this time. I don't know about in the area of the state of New Hampshire. Does anybody hear or have heard of anything as far as a body camera being ordered for EMS?
I would defer to Max on what he's seen. In my 11 or 12 years of here in New Hampshire, I have not seen any services, and I'm not familiar with any services in the state of people wearing body cams. Thanks, Max. Good question. What I will say is becoming more common is ambulances, particularly out west, not having body cams, but actually having a camera in the back of the ambulance. And that's subject to all of what Max just covered from a patient medical care record standpoint and everything else. But they are becoming more popular. Again, I'm not familiar with any services in the state of New Hampshire that currently own or operate either body cams or cameras in the patient compartment of the ambulance. The initial and later vital signs. So one of the best skills that you folks are actually going to learn in this class is actually how to take good vital signs. And you're going to take tons and tons and tons of vital signs on each other, on your instructors, and you're going to get really comfortable doing that. And that's just such an important skill. But it's a skill that transfers over to all of the care that you deliver, as well as the documentation side of it. So we want to properly record those vital signs in our narratives in our documentation. The treatment you give the patient and the outcome, I spoke to this earlier and why that's important. The agency and personnel who took over treatment of the patient. So a lot of times as first responders, again, you might not be the one actually transporting the patient to the hospital, but who did you leave them with? Right? Like, did you do a handoff to your local, BLS ambulance, your ALS ambulance? I'm not saying you need to get the paramedic's name, date of birth, social security number, and all that jazz. But it would be good to document in your report that at such and such time, Manchester AMR, paramedic Smith showed up, gave care and report to paramedic Smith to note the following. That's all really important stuff and helps tell the story. And it somewhat absolves you of liability for anything that happens to the patient after that point. So it's really important that you document that happened, especially as you transfer care over to higher level providers, EMTs, advanced EMTs, paramedics. And then any other helpful information. Of course, we want to put that in there. So questions on documentation. I know that was 2 slides and a lot of information, but we'll get more into that a little bit later in the course. Again, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So attitude and conduct, professionalism seems to be a theme in this chapter. So, just things to keep in mind. Looking at your characteristics. And a quick story, I'm not big into war stories, but you could have a paramedic who is the best paramedic in the entire world, but if that person doesn't know how to properly talk to patients or communicate effectively with them, if they don't have good bedside manner, it really doesn't matter. And there was a paramedic I worked with who was super squared away, totally textbook, like knew everything you ever wanted to know. And if anything was going wrong, you would want this person treating you. But something about his look or his mannerisms sometimes rub patients the wrong way. And that paramedic got complaints against them, not because of anything that they intentionally did or not about them as a provider, but just about their personality. And conversely, I've seen times where maybe EMS providers have really good bedside manner and patient report, but maybe they aren't necessarily the best provider from the standpoint of like doing it as the textbook says. So things to be mindful of. So we obviously want to be honest and conduct yourself with integrity. We don't want to lie to patients, and sometimes that can be challenging when you're trying to coerce a patient to put a knife down or not do harm to themselves or others, or if somebody asks you if they're going to die and everything in your gut says, yeah, you're probably trending in that direction, unless we can get you to a hospital soon. And these are some of the things you'll have to grapple with as EMS providers, but you got to take a long, hard look at yourself and kind of your characteristics and morals and values. So be aware of the patient's feelings and have empathy for your patients. Again, I talked about earlier, you're going to get called to some really bizarre calls if you join your local rescue squad, and it might be friends, it might be family members, it might be people in your community, and, they're calling on you to help them, on a really bad day, and, keep it together, stay professional. When you get back to your ambulance or back to your station or whatever, you and your crew can laugh it off, or do whatever it is you have to do. But at the time, we're going to be, professional, and we're going to deal with what we need to deal with.
Do we go more into later on just like what you do say in certain situations, or dealing with, especially if there's like a mental, something mental going on? Do we go more into that?
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the behavioral health emergencies in another chapter. Is it chapter 9 or something to that effect? It is later in the course. And if you have specific questions as we go through that training or that session, I absolutely welcome that. As far as what to say, it's really hard to prime you folks to say this is exactly what you say, because you're going to have different relationships with different patients, and based on the circumstances at home at the time, sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing at all and just be there and hold their hands. I've literally had transports to the hospital where all I've done is sit there, let the person cry, and just hold their hand, and not done anything else for that person. But that's what they needed at that point in time. So great question. It's really hard to prime you folks with certain what you say under what circumstance, because every circumstance is going to be different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question, Morgan. Thanks. And then being an advocate for your patients. It doesn't happen often, but from time to time, you'll come across a scene or a patient, or, somebody else that maybe isn't treating your patient with the respect or dignity that they need, or that you recognize something medically going on with this person that maybe somebody else hasn't caught. And the best example of that, a lot of times, us ALS providers, the advanced EMTs and paramedics, get so focused or fixated on, starting an IV and giving medications and doing this stuff, that sometimes we miss the basic stuff. And there's a rule in EMS, and the rule is BLS before ALS. We have to make sure people's airways, breathing, and circulation are good to go before we can start doing IVs and all that other fancy stuff that we jump into. As EMRs and as EMTs, our BLS providers need to be advocates for the patient and say, hey, Dave, I know you want to start an IV on that person, but before we do that, they're only breathing 5 times a minute. Don't you think we should ventilate them and bag them with a bag valve mask? Or, hey, I know you want to do XYZ, but are you aware of this going on? Or did you notice that their whole left side of their face was drooping and they're not able to answer our questions? They might be having a stroke. As EMRs, please, please, please speak truth to power, so to say. And if you see something going on that is not right with that patient, or if there's an ALS provider or even an EMT that's doing something that you don't think they should be doing, be an advocate for your patient and speak up. I'll get off my soapbox now, I promise. Also, appearance is a big one. Back in my days when I was a law enforcement ranger for the National Park Service, going through that training, one of the biggest takeaways for me was, some of the research and studies they had done on officer-involved shootings and incidents where people have resisted arrest. And what they found over time is that depending on an officer's appearance was actually an indicator for how likely a subject would be to actually fight or resist the officer. So what do I mean by that? If you show up to a scene and you're all sloppy and you're not put together, if you look like a soup sandwich, they used to call us in the academy, if you look like a soup sandwich, your partner's not going to take you seriously. Your patient's not going to take you seriously. Have a neat and professional appearance. And even as volunteer responders in some of the communities, you can show up in your what do you call them? Boots, not Carhartt boots, but your Timberland boots with your jeans on and your pager on your hip. But throw a polo on or a job shirt or something else and look neat and clean. because that'll put your patients at ease. Again, I'm getting off the soapbox though. All right, medical oversight. So we had a really great question earlier about med control, and this is part of the conversation on med control. So what we have to realize is licensed medical providers in the state of New Hampshire, we operate under of a physician's license. So anybody that's licensed and any service that's licensed operates under a physician's license. And every service is required to have medical service agreement and medical direction or medical control identified for their service. So the physician or medical director is the leader of the medical care team. He or she dictates what you can do and the circumstances for how you can do it. As indirect or offline medical control, the physician directs training courses, helps set medical policies and procedures, and ensures quality management of our EMS system. Can anybody tell me some advanced treatments or capabilities that some ambulance services in the state of New Hampshire have that others might not have? And there's one in particular I'm thinking of.
DART.
So I talked about earlier DART having like blood product or having additional resources and medications. That's a good example. What was another example that you threw up?
EKGs.
Most ambulances can do EKGs on their monitors. So that's kind of the standard of care.
Okay.
Does anybody know what RSI stands for? RSI stands for rapid sequence intubation. And RSI basically means a paramedic can chemically sedate you and take away or basically take over your ventilation and manage your airway for you. So they can sedate you and they can paralyze you chemically, and they can breathe for you. There are very specific criteria that they can step up and do that. And there's only a handful of services in the state of New Hampshire that actually have RSI capabilities. The medical director signs off on the paramedic's ability to be able to perform that skill and to deliver that care to the patient. So RSI is an example of how a medical director might sign off on additional skills that could be used locally. Thoughts or questions? Really what you folks need to know for your tests is what is the role of the medical director and the difference between indirect or offline medical direction and online medical direction. So here we kind of allude to offline medical direction. Can anybody give me an example of online medical direction, what that might be? So if offline, they're telling you what training you need to take, establishing policies and procedures ahead of time, and ensuring management of your local EMS system is an example of offline. Then online medical control is provided when you pick up the phone or radio and you're actually talking to that person in real time. So think online, you're on the internet, you're on the phone, on the radio, talking to somebody at the other end and getting their advice. So, hey, medical director, so-and-so, it's Dave Muse. I'm on the side of the highway with, a 53-year-old female patient who was involved in a rollover. This is what I see is going on. I'm not sure if she's a candidate for air medical transport. This is what I see. This is what I think. What would you like me to do? Because at the end of the day, yes, I'm a licensed provider and I can control and dictate how we extricate and treat and transport that person. But at the end of the day, my certification and the treatment that I deliver to that patient really comes back on the medical director and med control that signed off and endorsed me to do that skill or provide those services. So again, offline medical direction or indirect and online. Questions? Cool. MedControl is a really good resource. Don't call MedControl very often, but when I do, like, they've always been super squared away, and able to really help me out. And again, it absolves me from some liability, because at the end of the day, you know, I have a higher provider. There's no higher level certification than medical doctor, that is, you know, telling me what it is I need to do and how we should be treating this patient. Questions on, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, as far as med control goes, if you were to call in, I'm assuming that's like a direct line. You know, you would have, you know, highest priority to talk to somebody, I'm assuming.
Yep, and it depends again on your agreement, your arrangement with your local hospitals or you know, where your transport facilities where you're going to. A lot of times you'll call your med control that your service is licensed through, and it can either be radio or through a cell phone or telephone or something to that effect. You know, usually it's a physician in like the emergency department or someplace there that you're picking up the phone and you're talking to them. But yes, they're available 24/7 and a great resource.
I guess just a follow-up question. Is it more likely that you would be contacting med control over the radio versus cell phone? I'm not sure your experience in that. Is it depend on the provider?
I like it, provider discretion, but it also is predicated on what your coverage area looks like. When I worked for the National Park Service, I was in areas that didn't have cell phone. So dispatch would actually have to patch me through to a medical director or med control that was over the radio. So in some parts in Western New Hampshire or Northern New Hampshire, the only way to get a hold of them might be through a radio.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, Nick, go ahead, sir.
So essentially offline, you're out in the field and you're doing your directives of what you're stated and trained to do.
Correct. Yep.
For online, essentially, when you're in an ambulance and you're responding or reporting to the hospital with the patient and you are giving your online ER directives of your statistics of what you're finding, is that considered online as well?
Correct. When you're calling in a patch to the hospital to say, hey, you know, this is ambulance 2, I'm inbound to your facility. This is what I got. This is what I've done. Do you have any questions or anything additional you'd like done? That is an example of online. Yep. And the big offline medical or indirect example is what we call protocols. And we haven't actually talked about protocols yet. So this is a good time to bring it up. In the state of New Hampshire, we have what we refer to as the New Hampshire State EMS protocols. And this is basically a cookbook or a recipe book of different medical conditions or injuries and what we do at our different levels to treat the patient. And when we go on our next break, I'll pull up an example and share it with you. What I would caution you folks is don't go in and read your New Hampshire state protocols, because some of our protocols actually differ from the training that you'll get in this program and are a little bit more expansive than what you're technically trained to do at the national level. So what do I mean by that? I don't want you to get confused between your New Hampshire state protocols and the information you need to know to pass your national registry test. So quality improvement, great questions. And again, thank you to everyone that's asking questions here. Quality improvement. Quality improvement, it's a process used by the medical care system to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of current treatments and procedures. What do I mean by this? Well, at the end of the day, we write reports, right? We want people to go back and actually review whether certain medications actually have the desired effect and impact. We want to be able to use your narratives and your reports to be able to drive some of the data and the science behind our treatment modalities and methodologies. So we also want to make sure that you as providers are doing the right things in the field, right? If I have an advanced EMT who out of 100 IVs only successfully starts 5 of them, there's something going on there, right? Statistically, that person should have a much higher success rate at starting IVs than what I'm seeing in the data as I do my quality improvement review on that person. And it's not to get that person in trouble. It's to actually identify that and use the data to say, hey, there's an issue here or a training gap or a deficit. Let's review these skills with this person and bring them up to speed and get them squared away with it. So quality improvement is, a lot of it's derived from our narratives and the research components to the reports that we submit, but it's very important. So safety is huge. Obviously, the action of you folks as EMRs must not cause any harm to patients. The first rule of EMS is do no harm. Bystanders or our EMS providers at all. And we want to make sure that when you folks are out there operating in the field, that you're doing so safely, not just for you, but for your partners and your patients. So the quality improvement process is just that, it's a process. We also want to see what the effectiveness is of, again, the treatment I talked through earlier, using scientific knowledge and provide the desired benefit to the patient. For example, hey, I gave this person oxygen and it made a difference, or it didn't make a difference, and these were the circumstances. We also want it to be patient focused or have a patient centeredness, be responsive to the patient's physical needs as well as his or her values, religion, and heritage. Making sure that we're not improperly delivering care based on somebody's status. Making sure that we don't have providers that are biased out in the field or anything like that. And we want to look at the timeliness component, right? Like if you get on scene and your patient's in cardiac arrest and they don't have a pulse and they're not breathing, why did it take you, 35 minutes between the time your ambulance showed up or you got on scene and you reported the first chest compression was actually delivered? Sometimes there's good reasons for it. Maybe there were, the scene wasn't safe. There were dogs in the house. There was, it was a homicide. Like there's a laundry list of why that might have happened, but we want to make sure that the treatment that we're providing people matches up from a timeline perspective and that we're giving them timely care and that's appropriate. Also, efficiency, always strive to deliver care without wasting supplies, equipment, or time. A lot of you folks are probably on local municipal departments. We're taxpayers, right? And we don't want to be wasting people's resources and stuff out there. So we look at, we use the lens of quality improvement to make sure that we're not wasting supplies and equipment, as well as the equitability. Again, and I spoke to this a little bit earlier, not discriminating against people with different genders, sexual preferences, ethnic backgrounds, things to that effect. Questions on any of that? Cool. Your certification. So when you're certified as an EMR, you must follow the national or state standards for your level of certification. I talked about earlier that New Hampshire patient care guidelines or our state protocols. That's the cookbook. When you get your certification and you get licensed in the state of New Hampshire, that very clearly spells out what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do for patients. It's your responsibility to keep your certification current, and that includes components of continuing education requirements, keeping your skills up to date, and recognizing that failure to do so can actually result in penalties like you losing your license or your certification. So that responsibility is yours and yours alone. It's not your department's, it's not your ambulance services. It's your responsibility to maintain your certification. So in summary, the EMR is often the first medically trained person to arrive on scene. The typical sequence of events of the EMS system is reporting. So report, dispatch, the emergency medical response itself, vehicle response, that could be helicopter or ambulance, and the actual hospital care. The 4 basic goals of the EMR training are to know what to do, how to use your skills, how to improvise or how to use your kit, how to improvise, and how to assist other EMS providers. That's really, if you take 4 things away from this course, those are the 4 things we're hoping you walk away with. Your goal is to provide immediate care for a sick or injured patient and to assist more highly trained personnel, as well as ensure that your documentation is clear, concise, accurate, and in accordance with the accepted policies of your organization, because every organization does documentation a little bit differently. And there's so many different ways to do it that, you know, the possibilities are endless. Medical information about a patient is confidential and should be shared only with medical personnel involved in the care of the patient. That's huge. And a lot of people, you know, unfortunately have lost their licenses over that. They've gotten sued. You know, we're not sharing medical information with people that have no business or need to know anything about it. The overall leader of the medical care team is the physician or medical director. And then finally, quality improvement measures care in 6 different component areas: safety, effectiveness, patient-centeredness, timeliness, efficiency, and equitability. All right, let's jump into a review, and then we'll take a quick break and come on back to chapter 6. So review. You folks tell me either in the chat or come off mute here. The EMR must possess the ability to A, treat patients using limited equipment, B, ALS level skills, C, keep severely injured patients alive for extended period of time, or D, diagnose conditions in the field.
A. A.
I'm hearing A. I'm seeing A in the chat. Nobody wants to keep people alive for extended periods of time? That answer sounds good, but it's not really good. So yeah, you folks are smart, right? We want to teach you to treat patients using limited equipment because you might just happen upon a scene. All right, question 2. Let's call on somebody here. Ashley Ledger, can you read this for me and give me the answer? Nope. All right. How about George May? George? Breaking out tonight. Oh, George plugged in B. All right. So for a patient in cardiac arrest, which of the following interventions will you most likely be responsible for performing? Administering pain medication? Now, not as an EMR. Actually, the only people that can administer pain medications, actual medication through an IV or IM or whatever, is the paramedics. The advanced EMTs can use nitrous oxide, but that's an aside. B, CPR and defibrillation. You can definitely do that. C, IV or intravenous therapy. Can't do that as an EMR. And D, intubation. Only paramedics can intubate. So yes, those that chose B are absolutely correct. Number 3, when EMTs, AMTs, or paramedics arrive at the scene of an emergency, the EMR should, let's see here. Scott Holmes, you want to take a stab at this? Oh, see, people are, all right, you're all jumping ahead of me. Assist the higher level of providers in continuing care. Good job. Does anybody have any questions on anything we've covered so far in chapter 1? All right. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll reconvene at 8:55. We'll come back. We'll blast through anatomy and physiology and get you folks out of here. All right. So with that, folks, you know, you own your experience here. If you folks have questions or whatever, you know, I'm sure there'll be some good questions that might be beyond the scope of this class. We'll do our best as long as we're doing good on time to get those questions answered and go from there. And Max, I totally forgot to look up who published the white paper. Can you either answer that question for us or look it up, please, prior to departing tonight's class? Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. If anybody's looking for a good tattoo, you could get a copy of the white paper right on your back or legs or anyway. All right. So anatomy and physiology here. Really using simple knowledge of A&P function or anatomy and physiology function of the upper airway, heart, vessels, blood, lungs, skin, muscles, and bones. Really, it again is the foundation of emergency care, and how these systems react is really important. So when we talk about anatomy, of course, we're talking about the study of the structure of the human body. So our bones and in skin and things like that, how our body is actually composed, versus the physiology aspect, which is really the study of how the functions work within the human body and how they work together. Okay. So anatomy, physiology, and the difference. A&P for the purpose of our lecture tonight. We're also talking about lifespan development and really using simple knowledge of age-related differences to assess and care for patients. Because as you'll learn tonight, if you're not already familiar, different patients, depending on their age and size, they present differently. So as first responders, we need to be able to delineate what's normal for this person and what's abnormal for this person. And one of the ways we can do that is by figuring out what their baseline is and what kind of their norm is, or the average is, for their age and size. So introduction: to be an effective EMR or emergency medical responder, you must first understand the structure and functions of the human body. The knowledge will help you better understand the specific locations of the symptoms the patient is experiencing, because a lot of times, folks present differently. We might be having a heart attack, but the pain might be referred up to our jaw or neck or out to our left arm. If somebody's having abdominal pain, we can drill down based on how that pain is presenting and where it's radiating or referring to, and possibly have a better understanding of what it is that's going on. We can also, perform an adequate patient examination. Really important as EMRs and medical professionals. We need to do a good exam to understand, what's going on, what's not going on. Communicate the findings to other members of your emergency medical team. These could be fellow EMRs all the way up to the paramedic level in the field. And then obviously we want to provide the appropriate level of treatment based on what it is that's going on for this person. So when we talk about the anatomy, there's some medical terminology that you folks will need to know for your tests. I promise you, like if I could stomp my foot and reiterate, you need to know these terms for the test, and you need to know these terms to be good medical professionals, okay? Take the time to learn these cards, commit it to memory, however you need to do it, flashcards, whatever. Basically though, you look at the anatomy of this person. Anatomic terms are used to describe the location of injury or pain. So these are the anatomic terms we're referring to. All members of the team must be able to speak the same language when treating a patient. So this is the terminology that we use in our narratives and our reports, and this is the terminology we use when we're talking to the patient and talking to other providers that are there, right? We want to establish ourselves as medical professionals. In the event you can't remember the proper anatomic term for a certain body location, you can use the lay terms. It's just, again, what are we trying to accomplish here? We want to maintain ourselves and establish ourselves as credible professionals. So here you can see, when we use the term medial, we're referring to the middle of the person, right? Lateral is further away from the abdomen. Anything midline, again, is, imagine that yellow line running down the patient here. That's midline. Anything lateral is further away from the midline there. Superior means closer to the patient's head, where inferior is further away from the head, closer to the feet. The terms proximal and distal. Proximal means it's closer to the core of the patient, and distal means further away from the core. So we use proximal and distal when we're talking about the four extremities, the two arms, as well as the two legs. And then posterior is the back side of the patient, and Anterior is the front of the patient. Questions? This is sheer memorization. Anterior is the front, posterior is the back. If anybody, remembers back to their days in Latin class or whatever, a lot of these medical terms are derived from Latin. So anywho, all right, pushing on.
Can I ask a real quick question?
Absolutely.
So in the reading, it was with the lateral and the medial, and it was
Okay.
saying, so in this context, the eyes are lateral to the nose.
Mm-hmm.
So
Go ahead. Yep.
No, so I'm trying to sit there and picture it, and because, I understand the two terms,
Sure.
but in the context, the eyes are lateral to the nose. So would you just explain that, please? Because it was driving me crazy.
Not a problem at all. So what we're talking about is this midline here is the yellow line that runs down.
Right.
That anything close to that midline would be considered medial, and anything further away would be considered lateral. So if we're looking at the nose, we would say the eyes are lateral to the nose and the ears are lateral to the nose, versus the nose is closer to the midline compared to the eyes.
Okay.
So if it's on the midline or close to the midline, closer to that is medial, further away is lateral.
Lateral, right. Okay. I guess it's just something with the eyes throwing me off because there's two of them. So it's like, how can it be? I don't know. It's just, I understand the term, so that's fine. It was just the example. I just thought I could not wrap my head around, but no worries.
I'm trying to think of a better example here too. Max, you got a better example for midline versus lateral, or medial versus lateral?
Right. Okay. Okay. And that actually, that makes sense, and actually makes sense with the two eyes too. They're just putting them as a pair, but saying either eye is lateral too. So, okay. Thank you. I feel a little silly now, but it's
No, you're fine. The other thing I'd say is where my cursor is, like pretend that's a gunshot wound. Would we say the gunshot wound is more medial on the chest or lateral on the chest?
Let's say medial because it's pretty close to the midline.
Exactly. Versus, he's got a left-sided gunshot wound that's lateral to the chest.
Right.
So good.
Dustin, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Morgan, question? Oh, that was Morgan. Sorry. Dustin? Nope. Okay, pushing on. Anatomy and physiology. Here we go. In 54 minutes. All right. Topographic anatomy. When we talk about the standard anatomical position, we're really talking about the person standing facing you with their arms at their sides and their thumbs pointing upward, palms to you. Anterior is the front surface of the body, so we looked at that earlier. Posterior is the back side of their body, and the midline refers to the imaginary, that yellow vertical line that we drew from head to toe that separates really the body left half and the body right half. So this is what we refer to as the proper anatomical position. He's facing us, his palms are forward. Oops, sorry about that. Facing us, palms are forward. This is the proper anatomical position. And anytime we refer to left or right, what we're talking about is the patient's left or right. And I see providers mess that up all the time because, when you're looking or facing someone, it's the opposite. So just keep in mind, it's the patient's left or the patient's right. This is sheer memorization, folks. I promise you, it's not hard stuff here. Medial, closer to the midline of the body, lateral away from the midline. Proximal, arms and legs. Proximal means close to the core, distal means further away, and then superior I think close to the head, like Superman's wearing a cape. The cape's close to his head, inferior, closer to the feet. Questions on some of the positions? So let's talk about the respiratory system. Body systems in general. So body systems work together to perform common functions. The respiratory system really consists of all structures of the body that contribute to our normal breathing effort. The respiratory system brings oxygen into the body and removes waste gas and carbon dioxide. So just as important as it is for us to get oxygen into our body, fresh oxygen, it also, the respiratory system helps us breathe off carbon dioxide and other wasteful gases. Something we don't always think about. When we look at the respiratory system here, you can see it's comprised of these components. We've got the upper airway, really the patient's face, their trachea, which comes down, also known as like the windpipe. And then you get into the anatomy of some of the lungs and the rib cage that protects the lungs. So our rib cage comes around the lungs here to form a protective barrier. We've got our lungs on both sides. And then within the lungs, we have some different components here as well. We have the bronchioles, the main bronchi, and the lung itself. These components work together to bring the air or oxygen into the bloodstream, and as well as pass off those toxic gases and carbon dioxide that we breathe out. So that all work, we'll get into how it works together in a little bit here. Below that, we have our diaphragm. And what does the diaphragm actually do for us?
It expands when you're breathing to open up the cavity.
Absolutely. It expands and contracts, right? And that's basically an involuntary movement that we don't even have to think about. We do it subconsciously, right? It expands and relaxes, and that's what causes us to breathe in and out. The air, positive pressure, move into negative pressure, and vice versa. If you get a diaphragm injury, it's a bad day. So the anatomy of the airway here, the nose are also known as the nasopharynx. The mouth is known as the oropharynx. The throat, the larynx, voice box, also known as the voice box. Our trachea being the windpipe, and the different passages to the lungs. We talked through those a couple minutes ago. You'll need to understand, this anatomy here to be successful in the class and in the field. Here you can see the different components of the airway here. At the upper end of the larynx, there's a tiny flap of tissue called the epiglottis, and that keeps food from entering the larynx or the voice box. And I'm sure at some point or another, every person in this class has swallowed food and it's gone down the wrong hole. And that's just painful and a bad day. So the larger air passages of the lungs, the bronchi, branch into these different narrower parts or passages called the bronchioles. And really that's where the exchange, the onloading and on-gassing and off-gassing of, oxygen and the carbon dioxide that's circulating in our system is actually happening down at that molecular level. Hey, here's an even better picture to illustrate that. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the alveoli and in the tissue itself. Here you can see within the lungs, we've got our arteries. One of them is oxygenated and one of them is deoxygenated. And that down in these tiny air sacs, we can see the on-gassing and off-gassing of those gases, actually the exchange happening. So pretty cool. We just had a pig, we dissected pig lungs at our last EMS training and used bag valve masks and equipment to actually, see what happens when you bag a patient and whatnot. Really, really cool. Anyway, so the airway ends in these tiny air sacs called alveoli. Oxygen is inhaled. Air passes through the thin walls that separate the air sac from the blood vessels, and it's then absorbed by the blood. The carbon dioxide, which is the bad gases, passes from the blood across those same thin walls and goes into the air sacs and is exhaled. So when you exhale, you're actually breathing out the carbon dioxide and those bad gases. What you need to know is the rate of breathing increases when the body needs more oxygen or when it generates additional carbon dioxide. Either one of those will cause an increase in respirations or an increase in the respiratory rate. Everyone following? Hopefully. All right. When we look at the respiratory system, and again, the inspiration and expiration really is centered around the diaphragm. So air is inhaled when the diaphragm moves downward and the chest muscles contract to expand the size of the chest. So think about it. Your lungs get bigger, they fill with air as your diaphragm goes down. As air is exhaled when the chest muscles relax and decrease the size of the chest, and the diaphragm moves back upwards into the position. So air is exhaled when these muscles relax. Inhalation or inspiration and expiration. Questions? Cool. So the circulatory system, moving on here. The circulatory system includes really three components here, right? We've got the heart, we've got blood, and the blood vessels. And when I was in my training, I was taught to look at it through this lens. It's the pump, the fluid, and the pipes, right? So our heart is what beats and actually pumps and moves the oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood through our system. The fluid is the blood itself, blood, platelets, plasma. We'll talk about that in a bit. And the pipes, our veins and our arteries, are what hold the blood in place and actually completes and closes the circulatory system. So here we have our inferior vena cava. So that means the vena cava that comes down closer to the feet. And up top here, we have our superior vena cava, which is closer to the head that feeds the heart from the top. Superior, inferior. So when we talk about the circulatory system, we want to talk about the flow of blood through the system itself. And what we need to know or understand is that blood picks up oxygen in the lungs. We saw that earlier, and goes to the heart, right? Oxygenated blood goes to the heart. The heart then pumps the blood to the rest of the body, and the cells of the body absorb the oxygen and nutrients from the blood and release the waste products like carbon dioxide into the blood. So it off-gasses those bad products. Blood carries the deoxygenated blood carries the waste products back to the lungs and the kidneys. The kidneys help filter it out. And when it gets back to the lungs, that's where that off-gassing actually happens. And we're able to then exhale and breathe out the toxic gases itself. In the lungs, the blood exchanges the carbon dioxide for more oxygen, and the cycle just keeps repeating itself. So on-gassing and off-gassing. Wouldn't be possible without our blood. When we talk about the heart, and we'll look at it, actually, let's look at a picture now. So when we talk about the heart here, what's important to know about the heart is that there's 4 chambers of the heart. The chambers, if you drew across here, there's 4 chambers. The top 2 chambers are known as the atrium or atria, and the bottom 2 chambers are known as the ventricles. So again, what did I say earlier about right and left? I said we're always going based on what the patient's right and left are. So the top chamber that the blood comes in from the body through the superior vena cava comes into the right atrium. It then passes through the valves and enters the right ventricle. It then actually traverses through the pulmonary artery and goes into the lungs. And this is one of the few arteries that carries deoxygenated blood in our bodies. It then goes through that on-gassing and off-gassing process we just talked about within the alveoli, and then is returned to the heart through the aorta into the left atrium through the valves, left ventricle, and then out to the body. There are some really, really good YouTube videos out there that breaks this down and actually shows you a nice kind of flow diagram of the path of blood through the heart. Take some time to go find some of those. And as long as they're from reputable sources, you folks will be good. Your book does a decent job with it too, but I'm a visual person, so to see it actually go through. So what we need to know here, and you will need to know this and regurgitate it, is blood enters from the body, passes through the vena cava, into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, where it on gases and off gas, or off gases and then on gases, oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, then returns to the heart through the aorta into the left atrium, and then out the left ventricle to the body. Questions? Hopefully this isn't new to anyone. The arteries carry blood away from the heart at high pressure and therefore have very thick walls. There are three real major arteries that we talk about: the neck, the groin, and the wrist: carotid, femoral, and radial. You can see them here. And what do we know about these places on the body? What's significant about these sites?
You can take the pulse.
Yeah, it's where we take pulses from, right? You know, the radiofemoral and carotid locations here are where we typically take pulses from, because we can feel the heartbeat usually, as long as they have a decent, you know, heartbeat in these sites. They also, the arteries also come fairly close to the surface in these different locations, so it's easier to palpate and feel them as well. So the last component of the circulatory system really talks about capillaries as the smallest vessels in the system, and really at the, you know, as we start to get at the molecular level, veins are thin-walled vessels that carry blood back to the heart. And the four components, you will need to know this, are plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So these are the four components to blood: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Questions on the heart? So we've covered respiratory and the heart, very high level, but sped right through it. The next system we're going to talk about is the skeletal system. The skeletal system consists of bones and connective tissues that protect and support the framework of the body. The system really has three different functions that it serves for us. It provides support, provides structure to protect the vital organs and other structures in the body, and it also manufactures red blood cells. That's something a lot of people don't think about. Our bones actually produce red blood cells, which our bodies need. So a lot of, again, sheer memorization here, folks. You will need to know these bones and their general location. So, you know, I'm not going to read through all of them here, but your skull, working your way through the humerus, obviously, and it, you know, being the upper part of the arm, ulna and the radius, femur, patella, tibula, fibula. Take some time to learn this, commit it to memory. There's some coloring books that are out there with A&P that are super fun. Anyway, pushing on. The skull itself, really the bones of the head include the skull as well as the lower jawbone. The skull consists of a number of many bones that are actually fused together to form a hollow sphere that contains and protects the brain itself. So your skull protects your brain, makes sense. The jawbone is a movable bone that is attached to the skull and completes the structure of the head. So the jaw is actually considered an element of the head or the skull. The skeletal system, when we talk about the spine, a couple things you probably want to know about the spine. The spine consists of 33 vertebrae, each, you know, individual vertebrae. The spinal vertebrae are stacked on top of each other, and they're held together by a series of things. They're held together by muscles, tendons, which you can think of as like cords that are attached to muscles, or that attach muscles to bones, discs, and ligaments. The ligaments are really fibrous bands that connect bone to bone. So a lot of people get that confused. So tendons connect muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone. So know the difference between those two. The spinal cord itself that comes out of your brain passes through the hole in the center of each spinal vertebrae, and it's got 5 different sections to it. The cervical spine, which is the top part, your neck. There's thoracic spine, which is your upper back. Your lumbar, which is the lower back. Your sacrum, which is the base of the spine. And the coccyx, which is really your tailbone. You will need to kind of know the order of, starting at the cervical spine all the way through the coccyx, from kind of head all the way down to your tailbone. You don't necessarily need to know how many of each, I think there are, but for your awareness, there's 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 4 coccygeal vertebrae. And you can see how they vary and differ in size as well as width here, and actually change in form as you get closer to the sacral and the coccygeal vertebrae themselves. The skeletal system, when we talk about shoulders, you'll see a lot of shoulder injuries out there. Each shoulder girdle supports an arm and consists of 3 components: the collarbone, which is your clavicle, the shoulder blade on the backside, which is the scapula, and the upper arm bone, your humerus here. The upper extremity then consists of 3 major bones. The upper arm has 1 bone called the humerus. The forearm has 2 bones called the ulna and the radius. The radius is located on the thumb, so on the inside here, and that's where we're checking for radial pulses, close to your thumb or the lateral side of the arm. And your ulna is located on the little finger, your pinky finger, or your medial side. So lateral side, medial side. The wrist and hand are considered part of the upper extremity and consist of several bones. Just keep in mind. And then the rib cage. The 12 sets of ribs protect your vital organs like your heart, lungs, liver, and your spleen. All of the ribs are attached to the spine, and the upper 5 sets of the ribs connect directly to your sternum or your breastbone. So your sternum's in the middle here, your breastbone. The end of the 6th through the 10th rib sets are connected to each other and the sternum by a bridge of cartilage. And then the 11th and 12th rib sets are attached to the spine, but aren't attached to the sternum. So they just kind of float out there. They're also known as floating ribs. So let's take a look here. Here's your rib cage. The sternum is located in the front of the chest here. This is your sternum. And that actually has 3 components to it. The manubrium, which is up front here at the top or superior, the body, and then the xiphoid process. And if you feel at the top of your rib cage, where your ribs kind of come together and in, at the bottom of your sternum, you can actually feel your xiphoid process. I must look really weird to you folks. Thank you for bearing with me as I demonstrate all of these locations. So then you can see all the different ribs here. Your sternal notch is obviously at the top. Very easy to feel. So, questions so far? No, I'm throwing a lot of info at you folks. Also in the vein of the skeletal system, kind of moving down the body here, talking about the pelvis. Really, the pelvis serves as the link between the body and the lower extremities, or our 2 legs. The pelvis also provides a really important function because it protects our reproductive organs and other organs that are located in the abdominal cavity. Think about our abdomens are so soft and so just unprotected by any other real systems in our body. And if you have a trauma patient or somebody that falls or something like that, always want to be cognizant of and really curious to know if there's any lower abdominal cavity trauma or anything like that going on, because there's not a lot of protection there from our skeletal system. The lower extremity, obviously when we're talking about our legs, we're talking about both the thigh and the leg itself. And there's really two big bones here that we're talking about, right? The first is our femur, and the femur is the longest and strongest bone in the entire body. You'll probably see a question like that. The leg has two bones called the tibia and the fibula. Very similar to our ulna and our radius and our wrists, and our arm. The tibia, and fibula are very similar, kind of makeup. The patella is a small flat bone that protects the front of the knee joint. Hopefully everybody knows where their patella is. And then your ankle and foot contain a large number of smaller bones, which we're not going to get into in this class, but important to take note of, especially for ankle injuries and sprains and whatnot. So joints, when two bones come in contact with each other, a joint is formed. So a couple of examples of joints we'll look at the next slide. They're held together by supporting tissues called tendons and ligaments. I said earlier, tendon connects bone to bone. Muscle to bone, and then ligaments connect bone to bone. And finally, what's important to note about these is that there's a thin layer of fluid that's contained in a sac surrounding the joint that provides lubrication. So these joints can actually move. So here are the joints. Really three types of joints that we're talking about here are fused joints. They don't permit any movement between the bone ends. So think of like your skull. The hinge joints, which allow movement in one plane. So like your knee, your elbow, your fingers, like we can move, but I can't, there's only certain directions I can move it in. And then finally our ball and socket joints, which allow for movement in more than one plane. So like your shoulder, your hip, places like that. So if movement occurs beyond the limits of these movable joints, an injury will occur, right? So pretty straightforward. Questions on bones or anything that we've covered so far? All right, let's talk about the muscular system. Really, skeletal muscles provide both support and movement. These muscles cause movement by alternatively contracting or shortening and relaxing when they lengthen. So contract when they get shorter and relax when they get longer. Because skeletal muscles are under direct voluntary control of the brain, like I can flex in or flex out. They can be stimulated to contract or relax at will. So they're called voluntary muscles. You'll need to know the difference between voluntary and involuntary muscles. Smooth muscles carry out our different autonomic functions. So somebody doesn't have to think about control over the smooth muscles, which explains why they're called involuntary muscles. The third type of muscle is one we really don't think about a lot, but it's the cardiac muscle. And the only part in our body where that's located is in our heart. Cardiac muscle is really adapted to its special function of working all the time. And I'm not going to get into the physiology behind that, but the cardiac muscle has a rich blood supply and live only a few minutes without an adequate supply of oxygen. Part of the reason heart attacks are so bad. So, questions? Go ahead, Chris. Christopher? All right, Brian?
Could you just go over voluntary and involuntary muscles again?
Yeah, so voluntary muscles, I can control my function here. I can, I can flex or extend my arm. That's a voluntary. Involuntary is something I don't have to think about. It's automatically carried out by itself. So it, you know, it automatically does its thing. I don't need to think about it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Brian or Chris? Oh, all right. Moving on. The nervous system. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make my microphone work.
Not a problem.
So the cardiac muscle, you wouldn't consider it an involuntary. It's its own type
It for all intensive purposes it is, but technically they break it out into its own category because of the function itself. It gets into like they call it the sodium potassium pump. Is the, you don't need to know this, but sodium potassium pump, it's the exchange of sodium and potassium within the heart. Like, you don't think about that, it automatically does itself, but they break it out as its own category.
Okay, all right.
But yes, it is an involuntary, then that's a great example. The nervous system governs the body's functions or functioning. The nervous system consists of a couple of components here: the brain, the spinal cord, and the individual nerves that extend throughout the body. The brain and the spinal cord are called the central nervous system, and the cables of nerve fibers are called the peripheral nervous system. So again, you'll probably need to know the difference between central nervous system and peripheral nervous system as you go in to take tests and quizzes and whatnot. So you can see how the nervous system works together here. You know, you catch a ball or touch a hot pan, your sensory nerve endings in your extremity send a message up the forearm. The motor impulse to the spinal cord, nerve, and muscle travels through. It travels through your spinal cord, up through and into the brain to your connecting nerve cell. It then provides motor function and feeds your sensory and motor areas in the brain, and then back out, right? We can catch a ball. We can know what we want. You know, we can strategize movement. We're without even thinking about it. If somebody throws something at you, you know, instinctually you'll go to catch something or whatever. So, the nervous system. So the brain is the body's real central computer you can think about, and controls the functions of thinking, voluntary actions, and involuntary functions. The spinal cord's a long tube-like structure that extends from the base of the brain, and then the nerves branch out from the spinal cord to basically every part in the body itself. Questions on the nervous system? The digestive system really breaks down food into a form that can be carried by the circulatory system into the different cells of the body. Food that is not used is eliminated as solid waste. We know that. And major organs of the digestive system are located in our abdomen. The digestive tract begins at the mouth and continues through the throat, and then goes down through the esophagus into our stomach, travels through the small intestine into the large intestine, through the rectum, and then eventually out the anus. The digestive system also includes a couple other components. So you've got the liver, which basically produces bile that helps us digest fats, our gallbladder, and our pancreas. The pancreas is responsible for producing insulin to help maintain our body's glucose. And that's really important when we get into like diabetic emergencies and whatnot. There's a problem with somebody's insulin and their ability to effectively process or handle sugar or produce glycogen and glucose and whatnot. Questions so far? And I always butcher this. Oh God, Max, help me out here, man. I always butcher this. Thank you. Genitourinary system. What we need to know about this is it's responsible for the body's reproductive functions and for the removal of our waste products. Of course, when we're talking about the male anatomy, the major reproductive organs for males include the testes, which produce sperm, and the penis that delivers the sperm. For female, their reproductive organs are a little bit more complex. The ovaries produce eggs. The uterus holds the fertilized egg during pregnancy. The egg is then released for the ovaries, and it travels to the uterus through the fallopian tubes. And then the external opening of the female reproductive system is called the birth canal, also known as the vagina. The removal of waste product overall begins in the kidneys. And think of your kidneys as basically a filter to help filter blood from urine. And the urine flows down from the kidneys through the tubes, ureters into the bladder. The bladder then collects and stores the urine before it passes out of the body through the urethra. Questions on the oh God, I'm not even going to try. All right. Skin. What do we know about skin? Well, skin covers all parts of the body. Really has three big functions. It protects our bodies from harmful substances in the environment. It also helps us regulate our body's temperature. And finally, transmits information from the outside environment to the brain. So I talked about the central nervous system in the process of, like, if you put your hand on a hot stove or something like that, how that information travels from your hand all the way up through the spinal cord and into your brain. The skin has a couple layers here. The dermis is the deeper or inner part layer of the skin. The epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin, which is located on top of the dermis. Better picture here. You can see the epidermis is the upper layer here. The dermis is further down. And then the subcutaneous layer, you can see this is all fat and fairly, adipose tissue. Veins and arteries pass through here. Hair follicles come up. Your sweat glands and nerve endings are all built in. And then the sensory receptors are close to the surface of the skin, coming up on the dermis to the epidermis layers. So, the sensory receptors can actually sense what's going on. So the skin is an effective barrier to things like bacteria and viruses, unless it's coronavirus, as long as it's not broken by injury. So this is part of the reason we want to make sure we're keeping wounds properly dressed and sealed up. And the skin can perceive or sense things like touch, pressure, pain, and it can also detect various degrees of hot and cold and send the messages up to your brain accordingly. So when we talk about, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about stages of life here in growth and development. So I said earlier in our presentation that depending on a person's age and their size, there's changes, physiological changes that we can see, and maybe changes in their vital signs, or definitely changes in their vital signs, I should say. And that's important because we need to be able to compare that to what's normal and what's abnormal. So what's important to remember is that as we go through life, the body is always changing. I think it's every 7 years, everything in your body, except, well, not everything, but a lot of things in your body actually change over. So for an example, in an infant, the airway is very small and it's easily obstructed by swelling or foreign objects. At birth, infants can breathe only through their noses, so it's important to make sure that their noses are not obstructed. And from an anatomy and physiology standpoint, infants lose heat rapidly, so it's important to keep them warm. Because toddlers, who are really in that age group of 1 to 3, have poor coordination and balance, they're often at high risk of injuries, falls, or other traumatic events. So school-age children who are really that 6 to 12 age range are physically active and prone to injuries from bicycle riding or other athletic mishaps. So, football injuries, playing soccer, falling out of a treehouse, whatever it is. Just just things to think about. Again, I talked about the body changing constantly in our adolescent years, that 13 to 18 range. It's generally accepted that these folks see themselves as a little bit more invisible or invincible, and do not really understand a lot of times the consequences of different dangerous actions because their brain's not fully developed. In that vein, it leads to higher risk taking in incidents of things like vehicle crashes and things to that effect. In early adulthood, the 20 to 40 year range, it's really the period of time in anybody's life when most body systems are fully developed, and most people enjoy good health during this period of time. Middle adulthood moves through the 41 to 60 age range, and it's generally the time that the body systems start to decline. So things like vision and hearing become less acute, cardiovascular and respiratory systems start to weaken. Women experience things like menopause during their late 40s, and weight control becomes more difficult for most people. The final stage, really geriatric or late adulthood stage, 61 and older, the decline that we just talked about is really started in middle adulthood becomes much more pronounced. And people in this age group are more susceptible to things like fractures, burns, falls. You folks will go on a lot of falls and lift assists for elderly patients. The incidence of mental decline also increases significantly. Things like dementia and Parkinson's disease, you folks will see and experience that, unfortunately. So that's really the growth and development section, but it ties into the vital signs as well. So when we talk about vital signs, there's really three elements that we're really typically measuring in a normal set of vital signs: the pulse, the heart, which is the heart rate. And what we want to really measure there is your rate, how fast it's beating, your rhythm, is it a lub-dub, and the quality. Is it strong? Is it weak? Is it thready? So when we're assessing a pulse, those are the things we want to look for. Our respiration rate, obviously, how fast are we breathing? And again, kind of what the rate and quality of that is. Are they super fast and shallow breaths, or are they slow and deep breaths, or any variation thereof? And then finally, our blood pressure, which we'll talk about in a bit here. But what's important to note here is that our vital signs evolve or change with our age. So for example, your pulse rate decreases with age as a rule. Your respiratory rate decreases with age, and your systolic blood pressure typically increases with age. So let's take a look at the chart here. So when we look at the rate of pulse rate, respirations, and systolic blood pressure for infants who are newborns to 1 year old, their pulse we expect to be in the 90 to 180 range. Respirations, 25 to 60 breaths a minute. And their systolic blood pressure we would expect is somewhere in the 50 to 95 milligrams of mercury range, which when we get into vital signs, or when we get into actually taking blood pressures, we'll review that. Children, you can see here, their pulse rate slowed down a little bit, as has their respirations, but their systolic blood pressure has increased. And then the adults, you really want to know these ranges. And if there's one chart in your book, I encourage you to commit to memory, it's this one, because you really need to know what's normal and abnormal for folks. So again, your adults, a normal adult pulse rate's in the 60 to 100 range. Their respirations should be in the 12 to 20 ballpark per minute. And their systolic blood pressure should be in the 90 to 130, 140 range. I know that's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but any questions on anything we've covered so far? A couple of things can change the what was listed in that chart, or kind of the general rule of thumb. Things like somebody's size, their physical degree of conditioning. So a marathon runner should hypothetically have, a slower heart rate than somebody that's obese and 450 pounds and doesn't work out, right? That makes sense. As well as medications that the person takes, because some medications can actually affect things like our pulse rate and whatnot. If they're on cardiac meds or whatever, it can actually, no matter how hard they work out or whatever, their heart rate might not increase over, 70 or 80 beats per minute. So. Questions? All right, let's roll you through the summary real quick. What do we need to know? Well, the respiratory system consists of the lungs and the airway, and we talked about the different components there. The circulatory system consists of the heart, I refer to as the pump, the blood vessels, which is the pipes that carry it, and the blood, the fluid itself. We also talked about the 4 different components of blood: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. We also talked about the skeletal system and how it consists of the bones of the body and what you folks need to know about the different bones. The muscular system consists of 3 types of muscles. We talked about the voluntary or skeletal muscles, the smooth muscles, the involuntary muscles, and the cardiac or heart muscle. And we talked about the nervous system and how it consists of the brain, the spinal cord, and those individual nerve endings we looked at earlier on the chart or on the photo. The digestive system consists of the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, intestines, liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. And the genitourinary system consists of the organs of reproduction together with the organs involved in the production and excretion of urine. I got it that time. The skin protects the body from the environment. It helps us to regulate temperature, internal temperature of the body, as well as transmit sensations from the skin to the nervous system. And our vital signs change at different points of our life cycle, as well as our various body conditioning, size, things to that effect. All right, here are your review questions. A couple more questions, and then we'll have you out of here. So, which of the following patients is in the anatomic position? A man laying down on his back with his arms across his chest. A woman standing and facing you with arms at the sides and thumbs pointing outward. Thank you. I see B, a child on his left side and a man facing you with 12 feet apart. Andrew, go ahead.
I was just going to say B too.
Outstanding. B is the proper answer. When referring to the human body, the term proximal means closest to the point where an arm or leg is attached, a position that is closer to the feet, a position on the back of the body, or connected to the pelvis. Proximal versus distal.
A.
Survey says A. Nice job. Closest to the point where an arm or leg is attached. Again, proximal close to the cord, distal is further away. The respiratory system is responsible for transporting oxygenated blood throughout the body, ensuring that the body has adequate supply of red blood cells, removing carbon monoxide from the body, or D, providing oxygen for the body and removing carbon dioxide. D, nice job, folks. All of the above, right? The on-gassing, off-gassing, and on-gassing, right? Questions before I turn it over to Max here, who's going to talk a little bit about this resource on YouTube and close us up.
Thanks for everything, David.
Yeah, no worries. All right, back to you, Max.
All right. So, just a couple things. It's astonishing how much material that we cover in a short period of time. And let's see, I actually don't have that slide deck pulled up, but that last slide that he had up on the screen refers to a YouTube series called Crash Course Anatomy and Physiology. And the basics here is that it is a high school level anatomy and physiology course that is professionally animated. The host, Hank Green, is a professional science communicator. He's really fantastic. If you follow him on TikTok or Instagram or any of those other platforms, and he just gets the basics of anatomy and physiology across without really going too deep. It's definitely not a college level anatomy and physiology course. But why am I bringing that up? Well, anatomy and physiology is the foundation of medicine. You literally can't do anything else in medicine if you don't know what you're looking at and how it works. You can't know how it breaks unless you know how it works. And that's where paramedicine starts. That's where medical school starts, is anatomy and physiology. So it's not a part of this course. You're not required to go on there and watch those videos. I think there's like 40 or 50 videos. They're 10 minutes long. So that's a lot of time investment. But what I'm going to do is, in the online learning platform, each week I will put in a handful of videos that apply to the body systems that we're learning about that week. So if you want to go on to YouTube and you want to watch those in addition to the other material, you are welcome to do that. So that's the point of that slide at the end, just to let you know the resources available, and to just throw all of my weight behind what a good resource it is. All right, and I'm going to stop.